So, yeah, Bobby Fischer. I mean, the kind of the most well-known chess player in the United States, and certainly the reason that a lot of us got involved in chess. And again, for those of you I haven't met, I'm Lucas Anderson. I teach and coach, and then Warren Harper is the FIDE master, a lot better than I am. So he'll do the chess part, and I'll take care of the biography part. So I want to start by dedicating the presentation, actually, Dr. Frank Brady, who's pictured there. Dr. Brady is a professor of journalism and also a former executive director of the USCF. Back in 1960, actually, he was an executive director. And so he knew Bobby Fischer personally, and he wrote what I consider to be the best book written about Bobby Fischer. And if you're going to read one book, I'd highly recommend Endgame. And also, some of the pictures that I used in this presentation are from Endgame, and I actually emailed Dr. Brady and asked if I could include them, and he said, by all means. So I'm thankful to him for that permission. Okay, so let's start with Fischer's family. Born, you can see, 1943, died 2008. So Bobby's mother, Regina Winder, grew up in the St. Louis area. And her family had immigrated to the United States, and she grew up learning Russian, German, and English. She was quite an intelligent woman. She graduated from high school at the age of 16. Then she went to university in Colorado for a couple of years. Then she went to Europe, and while she was in Europe, she studied in Germany, and she met Hans Gerhard Fischer, who was a scientist there, a neuroscientist. And they fell in love and moved to Moscow, actually, in 1933, when anti-Semitism is on the rise with the advent of the Third Reich and the election of Hitler and all that, because they're both Jewish. So they moved to Moscow, where things are a little more favored. And while they're there, Regina is going to medical school, training to be a doctor. It's a 7-year program. And Hans Gerhardt is in what translates to the Brain Institute. And so in 1939, war appears inevitable, and so they leave and go to France. Now, as you know, Russia was invaded soon after that, so it was a fairly wise move. But the problem was Regina, who had finished who was in her 6th year out of a 7-year medical school program, basically lost all of that because it didn't count anywhere else. And we'll hear about how that affected her later. Hans Gerhardt, they were in France, and Regina wanted to return to the United States. And they were married at this point. Joan, Bobby's older sister, had been born, and they wanted to go together to the United States. But the problem was Hans Gerhardt was closely tied to the Soviet regime, and it's not clear to what extent. He may have been an agent in Comintern, which was the same organization that Alexander Alyekin was part of. He may have also been the predecessor of the KGB. He may have been an agent for the Soviet Central Committee. What is sure is that he fought in the Spanish Civil War on the communist side, and he was not able to follow Regina to the United States because of that activity for the Soviet government. And so she came to the United States, brought Joan with her. This is in 1941, and Hans Gerhardt did not follow. So Hans Gerhardt incidentally ended up moving to Chile with a Spanish passport that he got after he fought in the Civil War, and he lived out pretty much the rest of his life there, although toward the end he moved back to Germany. Now, you may have noticed that they split up in 1941 and Fischer was born in 1943, and you may do the math and go, well, wait a second. It turns out that there is no evidence that Hans Gerhardt and that Regina had any contact after 1941, and Fischer was born in 1943, and it's pretty obvious that Hans Gerhardt Fischer, who's listed on Bobby Fischer's birth certificate, is not his biological father. The journalists pretty much agree that his father was actually Dr. Paul Nemenyi, who was a mathematician and a physicist at a university of Denver, I believe. Regina, when she returned to the United States, she resumed her university studies in Denver, in Colorado. She was at the University of Boulder. I think she's at a different university. And she started dating Paul Nemenyi, who was much older, like 16 years older or something. And they were never officially married, but it's quite clear that they had a sexual relationship, and it's also highly likely that Nemeni was Fischer's father. And if you look at a picture, there's actually a resemblance there. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it appears pretty obvious to me. So Regina divorced Hans Gerhardt in 1945. She did not actually marry Nemeni, although they lived together for a while in Washington State and on. And even when they separated, Nemeni was still there, was still visit from time to time, and he supported the Regina and Bobby financially, which is also interesting. And it's not clear if Bobby actually knew who his father was, but Nemeni knew. And when he died in 1952, when Bobby was 9 years old, Regina had apparently sent a telegram to Nemeni's son, who was much older than Bobby but knew Bobby, and who was actually his half-brother, and asked that son to inform Bobby about the death. And the son was really conflicted about that. He didn't know if he was the right person to break the news to Bobby or not. And so his name is Peter Nemeni, by the way, the half-brother of Bobby Fischer. And he wrote to a doctor who was involved in Bobby Fischer's care when he was a child. And the letter I'll read to you, this is on page 60. It says, "Dear Dr. Klein, I am writing to you for some advice on a question concerning Bobby Fischer. Paul Nemeni died recently, March 1st. I take it you know that Paul was Bobby Fischer's father. The question arises from a telegram that Bobby's mother, Mrs. Regina Fischer, sent me with a request to tell Bobby the news for her. I don't feel qualified to do it because I hardly know Bobby at all, having only met him twice and only briefly, and because I have no idea at all what his inner life and orientation is like. The matter is further complicated by the false pretenses about Bobby's identity and the parents' differences of opinion over this question. I fear that I would be reinforcing the lie by taking the job of notifying Bobby about Paul's death from the mother. On the other hand, I don't want to say no unconditionally, as I am not sufficiently familiar with the situation. I would therefore like to ask you either to advise me on this matter, or to tell the mother to notify Bobby, or to do it yourself, whichever you think is the right course. If you would do this for me, I should be very grateful. I have written to Regina Fischer telling her that I don't feel qualified to break the news to Bobby and that I'm writing to you for advice. Sincerely yours, Peter Nemeni, son of Paul Nemeni." So, Paul Nemeni certainly knew, or certainly believed Fischer was his son. Regina probably believed it as well, because after Paul died, she sent a letter to Peter Nemeni asking if she'd left any money for, if he'd left any money for Bobby. But it's not clear if Bobby actually knew. I think he did, but there's no clear evidence that he was ever told. Okay, so to understand Fischer's childhood and his personality, we really need to look at three aspects, and I want to start with intelligence. Fischer was extremely bright by any stretch of the imagination. He was evaluated with having an IQ of 180. So, and I've got a quote from Fischer on the bottom of the slide there. To put that into context, from this bell curve, you can see that most people fall in the range of about 80 to 120. Most people, the largest percent of the population falls within that, and 95% of the population falls between 70 and 130. At 130, we start talking about giftedness and genius and high genius and profound genius, and under 70, we start talking about mildly mentally handicapped, moderately mentally handicapped, severely, profoundly mentally handicapped. Fischer is almost, quite literally off this chart. For you math types, he was 5 standard deviations above the mean, which means about 1 in 100,000 people would have an IQ as high or higher than Bobby Fischer. So he was one of the smartest people, not only in New York City, but one of the smartest people in the United States at the time, if that evaluation was accurate. There's some things you should know about people who have high IQs. Academically, they tend to learn quickly, they have a well-developed vocabulary, they're voracious readers, they have strong memory. Personality-wise, they tend to be very inquisitive. How, why, asking tons of questions. They tend to be really independent. I'll do it myself. They tend to be very focused and self-motivated. They want to learn things that they want to learn, and they want to be left on their own to do it. They tend to be energetic. In fact, the crossover between giftedness and hyperactivity is very high. We call it a dual diagnosis in the education world. You have a You have an impairment and a gift at the same time, if you will. And Bobby was certainly hyperactive. They are extremely sensitive, typically very narcissistic. They are very honest, impulsive, and sometimes irrational. So they also tend to associate with older people. Now, Bobby was surrounded, for the most part, by his sister, who was 5 years older, and his mom, both of which were very smart and both of which were older. And so Bobby felt fairly comfortable with them, but he didn't feel comfortable with his peers. Now, in Bobby, all of the traits that I've mentioned were heightened because he was so far from the average. So understand going forward that he was very forceful in his opinions. He was extremely stubborn. He was highly intelligent, had a very strong memory, and he was very sensitive, among other traits. Now, there's some neurologic differences that Dr. Ponderato in the psychobiography of Bobby Fischer talks about. He talks about, dopamine receptors in the thalamus and this, that, and the other. I'm not qualified to discuss that in detail, but that book does a good job of breaking down the neuroanatomical differences. Second pillar I want to talk about is poverty. Fischer grew up in pretty extreme poverty. In fact, when he was born, his mother was homeless. Regina Fischer drifted from city to city, occupation to occupation during the Second World War, trying to find some sort of financial stability. And she was so desperate that the records show that she put up Joan Fischer, the older sister, either for foster care or adoption before Bobby was born. It's unclear which it is, but she was overwhelmed, we could say. Now, that adoption didn't actually go through because among the belongings that were sent with Joan Fischer were some communist materials that the host family was very perturbed by, and they actually contacted the FBI, and Regina had to recover her daughter. But they did get some help from halfway houses, from shelters, from local Jewish community organizations like Jewish Family Services. Paul Nemenyi sent money to Regina for Bobby, presumably, through Jewish Family Services in various cities around the country for the first 9 years of Bobby's life while Paul was alive. But understand that Bobby was limited in the sense that he had, worn clothing. He was always in corduroy pants and T-shirts because the family couldn't afford anything better. Regina was constantly working all day, studying all night, so that she could try to get a better education, finish her medical licensing. She was going to nursing school at this time, and so throughout Bobby's childhood, all the way through his teenage years, they suffered from that, and keeping a roof over their heads was a challenge. The third thing I want to talk about is solitude. Now, I mentioned that Regina was in nursing school and that Bobby was without her for much of his childhood. Joan also, being 5 years older, had her own life to live. She was studying for school. She'd be over at friends' houses. She was involved in clubs after school and this, that, and the other. And from about the age of 6, when the family moved to Brooklyn, New York, Bobby was what we would call now a latchkey kid. He came home on his own, was expected to take care of himself, and he might be there for several hours until somebody came home to fix dinner. And for that time, he was expected to behave. The landlord was very clear that he couldn't be out in the hallways making noise or, running up and down the stairs. And even for a while, he got so bored he would jump off of his bed and see how far he could make it. And that annoyed his neighbors as well, so the landlord put a stop to that. So he was bored out of his mind. Now, which means that when he stumbled upon chess, he latched onto it. He took that giftedness that he had, and he took that loneliness and boredom that he had, and he channeled it all into chess. Now that started at age 6. At age 6, Joan is trying to keep Bobby occupied. She's giving him mazes and puzzles to do, and he enjoys them. He enjoys trying to figure out how exactly to navigate that maze before he even draws a line. And so Joan spends $1 and they buy a chess set at a pharmacy and they start playing chess, and Joan is not all that interested in it. She plays a couple games with Bobby from time to time, but Bobby just latches onto it, and he doesn't have anybody to play, so he plays himself. He doesn't have any books to read, so he just he's just the idiot savant, sitting down and playing chess. He's got no formal education in it, but he's got time. Lots and lots of time. By age 8, he's really good and he's really interested and he's really bored, so his mom sends a letter to a newspaper called the Brooklyn Eagle and says, are there any boys about age 8 who would play my son? Now, they didn't know how to categorize that ad, so they didn't even publish it, but they referred, the editor of that paper knew that there was a simul coming up at the the Grand Army Plaza Library, and that several masters were going to be there, and they suggested that Regina take Bobby, so she did. And his first game was in a simul against Max Pavey, who was a radiologist by trade, but a really good chess player by passion, and Fischer played him and got beat, as we might imagine, beat pretty handily. But while he was there was a gentleman by the name of Carmi Negro, who was the president of the Brooklyn Chess Club, who saw Bobby playing and saw how focused he was. And so he invited Bobby to come to the Brooklyn Chess Club. Now, this was pretty unheard of. Bobby's an 8-year-old child. The chess club is adults only. But Carmi Negro, as president, can basically say, I want to invite him. And so Bobby went. And at first, he lost every single match, right? Oh, and by the way, the Brooklyn Academy of Music is where the chess club met. It's also where Carmi Negro performed and taught music lessons in addition to his chess duties. And Fischer lost a lot, and the older patrons of that chess club would hurl around the word fish, like donkey, as an insult for a weak player, but it was very close to Fischer's name, and so he was, and of course he's a very sensitive boy, and he broke down in tears a lot, but he kept coming. Every Friday he'd go to the Brooklyn Chess Club, and every Saturday he'd go to Mr. Negro's house for individual lessons on chess and also music. He got really good at the accordion. And so Fischer maintained this relationship until he was about 13 in 1956 when Mr. Negro moved to Florida. Now, he started also studying on his own. So here are various pictures. Bobby studying in the Grand Army Plaza Library. Bobby with a chess set in the bathtub. That's his mom's foot on his head. And of course, and of course a carton of milk nearby because he drank tons and tons of milk. And then magazines at the top, like Chess in Russia. He wanted to get his hands on as much material as he possibly could, and he read prolifically. That book he's reading is The Games of Alyakin, by the way. I don't know if you can read it, but reading attentively in the Grand Army Plaza Library. And so he just used all this free time that he had to just devour as much information as possible. Another strong influence in his life was Jack Collins. Now, Jack Collins was a member of the Manhattan Chess Club, and where Bobby started playing. And Jack Collins ran an informal little chess club out of his house called the Hawthorne Chess Club, and he invited various masters and up-and-coming, talented kids to come play. And for Collins, this was a good escape. He was wheelchair-bound, so he was pretty limited in what he could do. But Bobby loved going and playing because they would just play. Just play and play and play. And there was no real age distinction, like I'm older than you, so listen. And Collins was very hands-off. Like he would ask Bobby questions, like the Socratic method. What do you think about this position? What do you think about this game? And they would just talk it over and analyze. And Collins, perhaps most importantly, had probably the largest private chess library in the United States at the time. He had about 1,000 chess books in his library, which Bobby obviously devoured. And so from here on out, once Bobby could take the subway by himself, he was over at the Manhattan Chess Club as often as they were open. And when they weren't open, he might have been at Jack Collins' house. In fact, by some estimates, he ate more often with the Collinses than he did at home. And Collins became kind of a surrogate father for Bobby, as Carmi Negro had been, and as others would later become, because, that was certainly lacking. Not only was he lacking a father, he was pretty much lacking a mother. And so anywhere he could play games of chess and socialize, it was just really important to him. Also, we should mention William Lombardi, Grandmaster, earned the title in 1960, and he was a world junior champion. He was about 4 years older than Bobby. He played at the Hawthorne Chess Club with Jack Collins as well. Jack Collins is in the background of that picture. And he and Bobby played a lot. Blitz, normal chess, analyzing games, you name it. In fact, Lombardi kind of took Bobby under his wing and tutored him privately. And mostly what they did is they just went through games together. Just went through games and analyzed them, went through games and analyzed them. Lombardi's not that old himself. He's only about 18. But he takes young Fischer under his wing. And by the way, William Lombardi is still alive today. He had an interesting career. He played chess, retired from chess, became a Catholic priest, accompanied Fischer to Reykjavik in '72 and was a second. Then later he left the clergy and started a family, and he still lives in New York City to this day. Okay, let's take a little break and talk about our first chess game. This was played in 1956, and you've probably heard of it before because it has a grandiose title of Game of the Century. And for that, I will defer to Warren Harper to walk you through that one.
Thanks, Lucas. Before I get started, actually, I was going to ask you, do you know who first dubbed it the Game of the Century?
Hans Komook. Hans Komook was the chief arbiter. We heard about Hans Komook in the Aljekin lecture, and Hans Komook was the arbiter of the game, and when it was played, a lot of players crowded around it, particularly after the leaving your queen en prise move. I mean, everybody crowded around and started analyzing it, and it was such a shock that that many masters who were playing commented on it immediately, and how promising Fischer was as a result. But yeah, Hans Komook declared pretty much immediately that it was the game of the century.
Well, I had no idea. I assumed that was a posthumous decision.
No.
Yeah. Okay. Or maybe Fischer dubbed it. Anyway, I could see that. He has pretty grandiose language in some of his books. Now, interesting note, even though it's been dubbed the Game of the Century, he does not include this in his book of his most memorable games. That famous book he wrote in 1969, I think it was. I've never really known the reason for that.
Oh, because 60 Memorable Games covers 58 through like 67 or something. He had another book of chess games that was published previously, and I don't know if this game was in that book, but it was the time frame. He was only publishing the games in a certain window, so I think it started in 58. And this one was played in 56.
I was curious why, because Kasparov in his book, he also mentions that this is one of Fischer's favorite games. So I was kind of surprised to hear Kasparov say that, and he didn't include it, but now I know why. Okay, so anyway, we'll just get started with the game. Now, his opening choice is kind of a reflection of his personality. So here he's inviting a King's Indian. It ends up turning into a Grunfeld defense here. Now, he included this in his repertoire because he liked to win. He did not like to draw. He was very competitive. You probably know that from his 11-0 win of one of the U.S. championships. So this guy did not like to draw. He wanted to win. So King's Indian and Grunfeld are really, I don't know what the right term is, known for being aggressive, basically, uncompromising. He's not playing Queen's Gambit Declined or Slav or anything like that. So he's playing to win. So here, opening theory wasn't really too well developed in this line at the time. Really, up to this point, probably the best Grunfeld player that you could imitate would be Aljekin. And he didn't play the Grunfeld really too much. So Kasparov was really the one who took it under his wing later on. So he played this c6 move, which is a little bit passive. Now, it's known now that this move, knight a6, is far more active, with the idea of playing c5. So black is just really trying to open up this position and activate his pieces, and c6 really kind of hampers him. So, yeah, knight bd7 is also a slight mistake, so black needs to play b5 here. Again, you really need to seek the initiative here. And after, say, queen b3, a move like queen a5, black really has to try to open up this position immediately. Okay. But anyway, so knight bd7. It's hard for me to criticize any of these moves because of what happened, but I'll do my best. Okay. So the c5 square, by the way, is kind of typical for this line where you put the queen on b3. I should mention, when you play queen b3 in the Grunfeld like this, it's known as the Russian game or Russian variation. Okay. Now the queen on c5, it may look kind of bizarre. I remember when I first saw this, I was kind of confused. really white's idea is just to try to keep an eye and stop c5. In this case, white's actually occupying the square with his queen. Turns out this ends up being an unfortunate square, but this move is actually okay. And here, white is still okay. He kind of made his last mistake, I guess. He should have just played bishop e2, trying to get castled, stopping his pawns from being doubled. But he decided to be more ambitious, I guess you could say. He played bishop g5. And amazingly, this turns out basically to be a losing move. Now, for those of you familiar with this game, you might know black's next move. This was shocking to me, and it took me a long time to understand why this even worked. But do you guys want a moment to see if you can find his move? This was the first of 2 spectacular moves he played in this game. It's one of the most unique tactics I've ever seen. Should I just reveal it, or do you still want your chance to find it? Okay, okay. I didn't hear a peep, so...
Let it go.
If anybody finds this with their first time looking at it, I would be pretty shocked. Huh? It doesn't mean you can't try.
Can I give him a head?
Yeah, go ahead.
The goal is attacking. I mean, the goal is, one potential goal would be attacking the e5 square.
I think you mean the square next to it.
E4, sorry.
Yeah. That's a rather large hint, but yeah.
Yeah.
Knight to a4.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah, this move is pretty impressive. So at the cost of a piece, black wants to really open up the center, right? Capture e4, and then white's knight ends up on the rim. His pieces, like on g5, end up being very vulnerable. And in the game, white didn't take the knight. But if he did so, clearly black would take on e4, right? And white has a problem. It's kind of hard for him to guard all his pieces. For example, if queen c1, eyeing the bishop, which by the way is in danger because if white plays a move like queen c2, then bishop f3 wins. White will be left with a shattered pawn structure, and black has a nice initiative. So a move like queen c1 fails to queen a5. White has a problem here. Wait, I think it's, yeah, queen a5, and now knight c3. How does black win?
Bishop takes f.
Right, bishop takes knight. Now, although the queen defends the bishop, black also had an attacker. So again, white's position is pretty shattered. And if you play a move like queen takes e7, queen a5 is again devastating, and it's probably going to be even worse because of rook e8 coming. So white did not go for this. So queen a3. Now knight takes. And knight takes pawn. So black succeeds in at least opening up this e-file. Now white's going to be just down a pawn if he doesn't take on e7. So really he's kind of obligated to go in for this. Now black just shifts the queen to b6. Now the idea here is that if white captures this exchange, this is a terrible idea because white's king is very weak. For example, if queen b3, black can even head for an endgame. And after rook e8, it's pretty hard for white to save this position. You know, for example, bishop e2, just knight takes c3, and it's kind of nasty. You know, rook d2, bishop b4. This is not a fun position for white to play. So unfortunately, taking the exchange is not going to help white. So, I mean, it's kind of hard to suggest anything better, by the way, for white here. This is already kind of a pretty bad position, okay? So knight takes pawn. Now the point of this is that if he takes on c3, then black pins the bishop to the king. And again, he's going to lose material. So white doesn't really have a choice. He has to try to save something here with bishop c5. And now black slides the rook over, forcing this ugly, ugly move. But now it's not necessarily so obvious what black can do because his knight's hanging and his queen's hanging. And if you play a move like knight b5, it's not entirely clear what's going to happen after, say, I don't know, queen d3. White's at least surviving. Okay. But of course, this is not what Fischer did. Okay. Now you're probably able to guess what the move is here if I give any kind of hint. So this is where he makes his second spectacular move. On a personal note, this was probably the first game I saw where black made, or not just black, but any side made a queen sacrifice that was not resulting in some kind of direct checkmate. I'd never seen any kind of positional queen sacrifice like that.
Not a forcing sequence of moves.
Right, because there's no way black could have calculated checkmate. It was just overwhelming material superiority, basically, in the end.
Just take rook on d1.
So if you take on d1, then white will take on b6. And if, say, a takes b6, then queen c1. And unfortunately, you're going to drop this knight. One of the spectacular things about this move too is it seems so hard to find. It combines some parts that make it difficult psychologically to even think about. So, what's that? On f3? So if we take that, I think, well, what's best here? I think white can take the queen here, and he has a couple hanging pieces. So, you know, if a takes b, then queen takes knight. Now, although black definitely has some compensation, it's not enough to justify it. I guess he has bishop and rook for the queen, but you know, black may actually be able to hold that, but he certainly is better.
Knight b1.
Knight b1. Okay. So what's your idea?
I have no idea. If he takes, I take the other queen.
Well, +1 for coming up with the shocking move.
Yeah, I take that queen. And then attack on c4 as well. I don't know.
No, normally it's those kind of moves that you would get garner exclaims, but it's a little too extreme here.
Is it queen b1 then?
Well, it's a nice try. I think white will just take it, right? Yeah. That would be the ultimate in hope chess, hoping for queen takes knight, right? Yeah.
It's bishop to e6, right?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, this move is a shocker. You know, it looks like it doesn't solve any of black's problems. All black's doing is attacking a white bishop, right? Black has hanging knight and queen, and all he does is attack another white piece. Logically, it just makes no sense, right? When you see this kind of position. It's so unintuitive, but it's so strong once you see it. Of course, the idea is that the white king gets windmilled, right? But whenever you have a windmill like that, it's a pretty dangerous thing. So that's really what the consequence here. Now, the first point is that white cannot just take the bishop and leave black with two hanging pieces because of what?
Queen b5 check.
Right. Queen b5. King e1 results in mate in 1. And if king g1, black has a very pretty smothered mate, which I heard somebody discussing. So I will give the man who did not have the opportunity to get the smothered mate, give it for us today. So can you tell us how to perform the smothered mate here?
Okay. Well, let's see.
I'm giving you one shot, one opportunity.
Ooh. All right, I'm gonna knight e2.
Good start. King f1 is the only legal move.
And then knight g3.
All right. Now king e1 results in mate in 1, so king g1 is the only move.
And then you do the queen f1 check.
Queen f1. Again, white has to take with the rook.
And then knight e2 smothered mate.
Yep.
Yes!
Yeah, it's a pretty picturesque position. I mean, This would be the ultimate satisfaction of every chess player, I think, to give this kind of checkmate with king straddled by 2 rooks. Very pretty. Of course, Byrne was not going to go out like this, so instead he just took the hanging queen, right? But unfortunately, he ends up in this deadly windmill, and it's going to cost quite a lot of material. Now, here's a good point for chess-wise here. So when you have a windmill like this, it's good to take everything you can, right? When your opponent has no choice. So again, just goes back and forth a little bit. And now moves a knight with tempo, attacking the rook. White has no choice. And now White's queen is under attack and his rook is under attack. He's going to lose more material. Now, by the way, he can't really protect this rook, because if queen c1, how does Black win?
92 check.
92. Yeah, and he loses the queen with check, right? Even worse. So he, yeah, back again. So he decided to play queen b4, and here Fischer mops up nicely. Rook a4, just simply defending the bishop. It's well placed, so don't worry about moving it. Now, this h3 move is kind of necessary. Because if you, for example, took on b7, how should Black play here? Yeah, bishop d4, right? Threatening checkmate, and White can't chop the knight because he gets mated. Okay. Now he can avoid checkmate, but after, for example, I think knight takes f2, it's not looking very good.
He's going to move the king now.
Yeah, this is.
He's going to lose his last
So Byrne was not so greedy. He tried to safeguard his king, but nonetheless, f2 is still a weak point. And here it's quite pretty what Fischer's done now. I mean, all of his pieces are guarded. This is exactly a perfect demonstration of how you play with pieces against the queen. You want to make sure they're all defended, and in this case, he has 2 passers on the queen side. Now Byrne kind of, I'm not sure what the right way to put it. He went out swinging, I guess. Yeah. I forget who said this, but there's a quote that if you're gonna die, you might as well die with your boots on, you know, that kind of thing. So that's pretty much what happens here. Just lunges forward, but Black's bishop comes into the game with devastating effect. And here it's just forced checkmate. Check after check. And here, let's see if you can find the mate that Fischer did.
Rook c2.
Yeah, rook c2 is what he chose. Of course, there was another option which he didn't choose.
Bishop a3.
Bishop a3, right. Yeah, we'll never know why he didn't choose bishop a3, but yeah. So, of course, Byrne was respectful and allowed Fischer to checkmate him. You know, by the way, according to chess etiquette, if your opponent plays a brilliant game against you, you should play it out to checkmate. Preferably a pretty one if you can. It's only polite. So yeah, this game really demonstrates some chess maturity. I mean, Fischer was basically a boy at the time of this game. And this was absolutely brilliant, finding these moves, knight a4 and bishop e6. It's pretty incredible that a kid of his age could find these kind of moves. They require you to overlook some classical chess rules you're taught. You know, when you have 2 hanging pieces, you're not taught to leave them there and just go about your way attacking other things, right? It also kind of speaks to his fighting spirit. You know, despite Byrne being the stronger player, I mean, I think Byrne already at the time was a pretty strong master.
Yeah, he was a master.
Yeah, so you know, he was definitely better than Fischer, generally speaking, anyway. But although after this game, it's kind of hard to say that. But it really goes to speak to his competitive nature that he would sacrifice his queen against the master like that. But anyway, does anybody have any questions about this?
Can you go back to the windmill situation?
Sure. Okay. Let's go back. So you mean at this point?
One move back. No, sorry.
Back?
Here. It's white to move.
Mm-hmm.
Does just giving up the exchange with rook d3, obviously giving up the exchange isn't good, but
so black actually has a concrete method of attacking this. So he can play a takes b, and if queen c3, black has the pretty knight takes f3. The point being, if queen takes bishop, it's checkmate. I mean, it's arguable that this might have been a preferable way to go out, but that's
the way
semantics.
Wouldn't have been the game of it.
Yeah, it takes two to make a masterpiece, right? So yeah.
Had Fischer become generally known as a really good player at the time this game took place?
I'll talk about that on the next slide.
Right about that.
Yeah, this would be a game maker. And any other questions? All right, back to you, Lucas.
So let's address that question. How well was Fischer known at this time? How, in other words, sorry, let me skip ahead here. How well was he known? Well, in May of 1956, at the age of 13, Fischer's USCF rating was 1726, which is decent, for a 13-year-old. It's really good. But this marked the beginning of his rise to prominence. By July, he was the U.S. junior champion. That got him an invitation to U.S. Open tournament where he placed 8th. He then participated in the Canadian Open in August, placed 8th. Then he was invited to the Rosenwald tournament, which determined the U.S. championship at the time, and it was limited to the top players in the United States. But Fischer, even though his rating was pretty darn low, a lot lower than everybody else in the tournament, because of his tournament results, he was given a special dispensation and invited. And that's where the game of the century was played in that tournament. In round 8, actually. Now, Fischer didn't do all that well in that tournament. He placed 8th out of 12, which, for a 13-year-old is really darn good, considering you've got Samuel Reshevsky and Robert Byrne and, the top players in the United States playing. But, Fischer obviously would have preferred something better, but he's still learning. November, he placed 2nd in the Eastern States Open, played a couple more tournaments at the beginning of 1957. And in a one-year period, his rating went up 500 points. He went from, a Class C player roughly to a master. So by the age of 14, he was a master. And by 15, he was a grandmaster. We'll get to that. So, and he was known and pretty well respected by the people at the chess club. And, for one, he got a special dispensation for even being allowed to play in the chess club as a child. For two, he got a special dispensation for playing in the chess club in corduroy pants and t-shirts. That was not the attire at the time. And three, he got a pass on some of his behavior. Now, Fischer was not impolite by any means, particularly over the board, but he was vicious. Over the chessboard, some people said he played for blood. He won when he won, he was gleeful, and when he lost, he would often break down into tears. And he was also pretty antisocial. Dinker talks about how he wouldn't make eye contact with people. He'd look at his feet, and if you wanted to play, you'd come over and tug on your pants and say, "Hey, want to play a game?" And so they accepted all those mannerisms, and they accepted his dress, and they accepted his age because he was such a talent at chess. And here you have Biscayer's quote about just how strong he was perceived to be. Now, Fischer, at the age of 14, participated in his first U.S. Open to determine the U.S. Championship. Remember, before this, it was the Rosenwald tournament that determined it. And he played in his first tournament then in 1957, 1959 to 1958. At the age of 14, he won it. That was not expected. It was expected that he'd finish somewhere in the middle of the pack. It was expected that even though he was so talented, that he didn't have the poise, he didn't have the tournament experience, he didn't have the right mindset and self-confidence to win, and he surprised everybody by winning. In fact, he didn't even drop a game. 8 wins, 5 draws. And over the course of every time he entered the U.S. Open, 8 times, he won it. So he never lost a U.S. Open championship that he participated in. There's a couple times he didn't participate. In one year, he was preparing for an interzonal, so he didn't participate. And one year, they didn't have it, so he didn't participate. And then, after 67, he didn't participate anymore. But he just dominated. His combined record for the whole U.S. Open championship was 61 wins, 3 losses, 26 draws. And you can see that in 63-64, he actually won all 11 games. As Warren was talking about, Fischer was not a fan of drawing. He played for keeps. Even on a drawn endgame, he'd still play on. There's talk of, one time he's playing a really old grandmaster in a interzonal, I believe it was, and they adjourned like 3 times. The game took up 3 score sheets, and at the end, Fischer turned down a draw until there were only kings left on the board, and he still played 2 more moves. So he was determined, and if you remember the Petrosian lecture, I talked about the grandmasters and their draw percentage, and Fischer's draw percentage was like 25%, which is far and away lower than anybody else. Petrosian and Spassky were like 56% draws. Fischer was less than half of that. He did not like to draw, and in fact, the story goes that the chief arbiter, I think it's Hans Kmoke again, at the 1964 U.S. Open, went up to Larry Evans and congratulated him on winning the tournament because Fischer won the exhibition. Basically saying Fischer was in a class by himself. So this is a picture of Fischer from his very first U.S. Open. Now at 15, he is a very strong player, and he wants to go abroad and test himself against the Soviets. They're the best in the world. He wants to go play. So the interzonal was going to be in Yugoslavia when Fischer was 15 years old, and he wanted to go to Moscow before that. Now the family, of course, didn't have any money. So what happened was Regina Fischer actually arranged for Bobby to participate on a game show called I Have a Secret, where the contestants had to try to guess what this person was famous for, and Fischer was there as a chess master. And and as compensation for being on the show, he got 2 plane tickets, one for him, one for his sister Joan. And so at 15, Fischer traveled to Moscow. Now his tour guide / chaperone for the event, well, Joan was kind of a chaperone, but his tour guide in Moscow was Yuri Averbach, who was a fairly well-known grandmaster in his own right. And of course, when they get there, Fischer wants to go directly, not to the hotel, to the Moscow Chess Club. He wants to go where the action is, and so he goes, and he just starts playing blitz with anybody that he can play, and he's just destroying people. Doesn't drop a game. He's just knocking them down one after another, one after another, one after another. And he asks, he says, can I play Botvinnik? And now Botvinnik is world champion and patriarch of Russian chess, and this is an audacious question, particularly since nothing had been prearranged before. Botvinnik has nothing to prove, and another thing, Botvinnik wasn't actually in Moscow. He had a dacha, a nice little country home that he was staying at, and there was no way in hell that Botvinnik was going to be summoned to play some 15-year-old American upstart, So finally, the Central Committee, the director of the chess club in association with the government, called over Tigran Petrosian, who came over there to give Bobby some competition. And by all reports, Petrosian won the majority of their blitz games. So finally, they called over, an up-and-coming future champion of their own, and he was able to give Bobby some competition, and Bobby was pretty upset about losing, and he was pretty vocal in his criticism. Russian pigs this, lucky that, blah blah blah. Yeah, he was a sore loser, and so what happened was the Russian government, this is Khrushchev at the time, they actually canceled his tourist visa. And so he had to leave Moscow before he was planned to, and instead he went to Yugoslavia early, and they arranged for him to play a couple of matches there. And he just went there before the Porter Rose Invitational, and when he was there, he actually got to play some of these strong Russian players in actual time-controlled games, and I think that was where he first played Petrosian, and he won, and he first played Tal, and he lost, etc. So he was certainly a strong player, and since he wasn't expected to do well in that Invitational, but he finished tied fifth place, and the top 6 finishers were automatically seeded into the candidates tournament as part of the World Championship cycle. And if you were in the candidates tournament, basically you had to be a GM to be in the candidates tournament. So FIDE just automatically awarded him the GM title. And this is when Fischer is 15 and a half. And he was the youngest grandmaster, FIDE grandmaster, until I believe Kasparov came along. I think only Kasparov achieved grandmaster earlier.
No, actually, Judith Polgar later broke that record.
Okay.
He became the youngest grandmaster ever, even as a woman.
Judith Polgar, and there's a Fischer-Polgar story a little later. And so, Fischer's traveling around. He's spending a month here, a couple weeks there, and you may wonder, what about school? Well, Fischer pretty much despised school because, number one, it took him away from chess. And number two, as a very intelligent child, he didn't have much respect for the role of teachers and the role of school. He thought everything he needed to learn, he could learn on his own, and all he ever wanted to learn was chess. And so Regina Fischer was pretty worried about Bobby's obsession with chess, and she took him to 2 different psychiatrists for examination. The first one that she took him to said, well, it's a childhood thing, he'll grow out of it. The second one said, well, that didn't happen. Maybe at age 30 he did, but, and the second one said, well, there are far worse things that he could be mixed up in. Unfortunately, both these psychiatrists were chess fans, which may have been a mistake on Regina Fischer's part. Because the psychiatrist, and actually this came up in the Manhattan Chess Club, they had a little a meeting of the board of directors and said, what do we do about Bobby? He's kind of rude. He's kind of grating, and he's got some stuff going on. He maybe he's got this father thing. His mom's never home. He probably needs some counseling. And then they actually asked themselves, but what happens if he's cured? Will he still play chess? So actually, they didn't act on it. What did happen is Regina Fischer took Bobby to meet Reuben Fine, a name we all know very well, written several books on chess, a grandmaster in his own right, but what you may not know is it was Dr. Reuben Fine, and he was a psychiatrist who was a specialist in Freudian psychology. So Fischer goes and meets Fine, and at first they're just playing games. They go and meet like once a week for like 8 or 10 weeks or so, and every week it's just them playing games in Fine's apartment. Family's in the other room. Fine and Fischer are playing chess, and Fine wins a good percentage of these games because he's still one of the strongest grandmasters in the U.S. And on like the 8th or 9th meeting, Fine asks Fischer just innocently. At first he's trying to build rapport, and then he asks him, "So Bobby, how's school going?" And Fischer is offended, and he goes, "You've tricked me!" And he gets up and he storms out. As soon as the conversation turned to anything besides chess, Fischer was gone. And by 16, Fischer is no longer interested in school. By the way, he went to Erasmus, which was a private high school, which bent their policies to admit him. And they gave him free tuition and everything. He went there 2 years. He was actually there at the same time as Barbra Streisand and Neil Diamond. They were Barbra Streisand was a year ahead of him, and Neil Diamond I think was 3 years ahead of him. But he was there at the same time, and they gave him like medals for his chess accomplishments and such as that. And they accommodated his travel plans. But Fischer still wasn't having it, and at 16 he dropped out. By the age of 17. His relationship with his mom had kind of deteriorated to the point where she moved out, And from that point on, Bobby lived in their little apartment on Flatbush Avenue by himself. Joan had moved out, obviously. She had gone off to college and was in relationships and that sort of thing. So Fischer, is this, he's still on this transition between being a boy and being a man. And he's started to make a little bit of money. His tournament wins have helped in that department. And he has a conversation with Pal Benko, grandmaster in his own right, and probably Fischer's closest friend throughout his career, him and Bill Lombardi anyway. And Benko says, Fischer, you really need to do something about your look. So at 17, Fischer goes and meets with a tailor, and he gets some suits made. And from the age of, from 17 onward, gone is the Bobby Fischer in the t-shirt and the corduroy pants. In fact, his nickname was the Corduroy Killer. Gone is that Fischer, and in its place is someone who wants to look like a grown man, and he wants to act and be perceived as a grown man as well. And so Fischer starts thinking not only about his image, but also about his health, and he becomes pretty involved in athletics. You may not know, but Fischer was an avid swimmer. He probably could have been a competitive swimmer if he'd spent as much time on it as he did on chess, but it was therapeutic for him, and Fischer was a strong believer in the idea of taking care of your body just as well as you take care of your mind. And so from the 60s onward, Fischer is a grown man, and he has some personality quirks from time to time, some eccentricities, if you will, that we'll delve into later, that sometimes grate people, and he's not all that comfortable with the media. He's completely paralyzed around girls. But in the chess world, he is respected. And let's take a moment to look at another Fischer game from this time period, a little bit of an older Fischer, a little more understood, a little more respected Fischer, even though he's only 15 when this game is played. This is against Bent Larsen, and this photo is taken in '65, by the way, at the Piatgorsky Cup. Fischer and Larsen playing some casual games outside. And again, I'll turn it back over to Warren for that.
Thanks. Yeah, going back to the previous game, actually, I was going to mention the story about Fischer and Arthur Bisquire. So, in that same tournament, they played a game with Byrne. He played famous American Grandmaster as well, Arthur Bisquire, and Bisquire beat him that game. It turned out to be the first and last time that Bisquire would beat Fischer. The next 13 games, he would proceed to lose to Fischer. He did draw one more time in his career with Fischer, but that was it. Yeah, the way he put it, it was Fischer never forgave me for that defeat. So, it's just kind of funny. No, with respect to this game, so Larsen and Fischer had played about 7 games before this, and they were pretty even at about 3.5 to 7. Now, after this game, the momentum would really shift in his favor, especially in 1971 when they played their candidates match. But that's later. But so let's get to that. Okay. So this game was responsible for a lot of opening theory fashions. So Larsen played the Dragon, which at the time had perfectly reasonable reputation. Okay. Now, one thing that we'll learn from this game, and he showed this many times throughout his career, he loved having his light-squared bishop, especially on this A1 or A2 G8 diagonal. He absolutely loved this light-squared bishop. And he would put it on this diagonal against the Najdorf, the Dragon, the classical Sicilian, pretty much any Sicilian variation where he could legally put it there, he would, basically. He loved that square for the bishop in the Sicilian. And he also just liked light square bishop in general. He played the Ruy Lopez all the time and tuck it away nicely on C2, that kind of thing. So, anyway, let's move forward. Now, knight takes D4. It's okay, although today modern theory prefers bishop D7. Okay, knight takes D4 definitely took a hit in fashion after this game, especially because of Fischer's comments as well, which I'm going to talk about. Okay.
That scares me. When you castle queenside and when you got the queen bearing down on those squares, that just...
Yeah, one of the interesting things about this position is that Black's pawn storm is actually more gauged at harassing the white squared bishop than attacking the king. Black would really like to basically clarify the situation on this diagonal, because he would really like to exchange it, but I'll mention here, bishop takes b3 would be a mistake, and Fischer mentions why actually. Now a takes b3 looks scary on the surface, but turns out, so this move will make more sense if we follow up with b5 first actually. Okay, now here bishop takes b3 would be a mistake. A takes is actually not the correct idea, because later on it'll allow Black, after moves like say queen c7, to play a5, a4 and open up this a file, and that's actually dangerous. Now it turns out you actually want to capture with the c pawn. Now even though any kind of endgame will basically be lost for white because of these doubled pawns on the queen side, the point is that your king is very safe, and in this dynamic position with kings on both sides, endgame is not necessarily white's concern right now. So this is important to know, by the way, in your own games. If you ever find yourself on the white side of the Yugoslav, if you play bishop c4 to b3, c takes b3 is generally going to be the right answer, okay? Because of this reason, you want to keep the a file closed, okay? So it's just a good rule of thumb. So anyway, so going forward. Now, Black is still fine. Fischer gets more and more excited about his position in his comments as we go along, but it turns out Black is okay. Now, of course, White's threatening to take on e7, and he's threatening this pawn on b4, so he really has to eliminate this knight. Now, here was probably White's first part where he went wrong, and he gave Black equality. Now, e takes would have put more pressure on Black. By the way, one tactical point. Black cannot win this pawn because of bishop takes g7, uncovering an attack on the knight. That's kind of thematic for the dragon as well, even though it'll look like knight d5 loses a pawn, because this discovery does not work. So anyway, the idea here is that White is going to have pressure on this backwards pawn to e7, so it's going to be kind of annoying. And White's king is also quite safe. This bishop really helps shield the white king here. So that would have been a better choice, but he played bishop takes because Fischer did not want to bury his light squared bishop. He wanted to keep it active. So I think he was playing kind of hope chess here. I think he was just hoping that Black would not play knight takes d5, because if Black does not, then he's going to maintain this bishop on that awesome diagonal. Okay. Now, of course, based on what I said, knight takes would have been the easiest way for Black to go. But instead, he plays rook a8. And it's a move which Fischer famously declares as the losing move, because after bishop b3, Black will not get a second chance to eliminate this powerful light squared bishop, right? Turns out he was a bit optimistic, okay? But he is right in that White has a good position, but it's not clear at all. So Larsen doubles up the rooks, which is okay. Fischer just proceeds down the h file. Now with h5, right? Now I think he mentions this about all you have to do to beat the dragon is just play h5, sack, and mate, right? Yeah. This Fischer's comments, despite not really being totally correct, really trashed the reputation of the dragon, and it was really not very popular for a long time. Although later on, when Kasparov played it in his World Championship matches with Anand, he really revived it after that. And today it still has a sound reputation. We've seen Carlsen play it, and that's pretty much the highest degree of respect you can give an opening, as far as I'm concerned. So the dragon is actually okay, despite the 30 years of deadness that Fischer gave this opening. Now, he did not take on h5, so this is a very dangerous idea, okay? If you take on h5, then we have bishop takes, okay. King takes, g4. White gets a really strong attack here. This is a thematic kind of idea for White. So here White just quickly eliminates the knight, and now White has a crushing move.
g6.
Right, g6. Fully utilizing this pin on the f-pawn here. So the idea is that Black's getting mated here. Right. So this is a pretty thematic idea in the Sicilian Dragon. Play h5 without preparation of g4, because this kind of idea usually works for white. So black did not do this. This got his other rook into the game. Now black's trying to get rid of this bishop by force here. Okay. Now is where Fischer plays this rook takes h5 sacrifice, right? Of course he thinks this is crushing, but black can actually save himself here, even here. So in the game, he played g takes h5, but this is definitely a mistake. Black can actually save himself. You guys want to try finding a save? A4. A4. This is certainly sharp.
Fischer F7 seems like a fine continuation.
Yeah.
Let's try Queen F4 or...
I was thinking Rook C2 is strong, but yeah, I think you're right. I think this followed by Rook H7 is pretty strong.
He has to move the rook over to G8 to protect.
Yeah, well, E5 might protect it, but I'm very skeptical this move is okay. Yeah, I'm not sure if Bishop F7 is necessarily so clear. You know, I didn't see this move mentioned.
You just go bishop takes g7?
Well, it's tempting, but A takes is kind of annoying.
But then you have bring your rook from d to h1.
Yeah.
You got to deal with that b3 pawn.
Oh, I see.
It's gonna go to c2
Yeah.
with check.
Yeah.
That's a problem.
I mean, Rook H8 is very tempting, but I can't believe this is actually good. You know, this is interesting. You know, one possible idea is, for example, king takes, queen here, and then white wins, right? So that's one idea.
Forced? Yeah,
Well, if king takes, now the critical variation is bishop takes, and now I was thinking of rook h1, but
it's not gonna win. You can
It does
like
look
F6
interesting.
or something like that and block the other bishop. Oh, you know that no, you can't do that. It's pinned. Ooh.
and if you play like e5, then queen h2.
And that's, well, even that isn't. He can still get his king out of the, he can put king to f8 and get his king out of trouble.
Interesting. Well, I don't have an answer for why a4 is bad, so let's consult Houdini. Oh wait, you don't have Houdini installed, you have Stockfish, that's right. I'm thinking my computer. Well, let's see what Stockfish has an answer. Oh, he says rook h7.
Wow.
Oh my, okay. Yeah, this was not obvious to me.
Amaze balls.
Wow. This is strong. So if bishop takes d4, then queen takes.
That's just
Wow.
And you still can't move the f pawn because it's still there. You can cut
Fischer's
it.
not taking it.
Oh my goodness. And if like queen e5, then oh wow, then you have this. Oh, that's not nice. Wow. Okay. So yes, to answer your question, John, looks like the obvious rook h7 is why this succeeds. You know, I'm curious though that Fischer doesn't mention this in his analysis.
It was obvious to him.
Probably.
Yeah, seriously. Anyway, so black does have a savior to his position here, and it comes in bishop takes d4. And this is not really obvious. So the idea is after queen takes and g6, so it looks like white's wreaking havoc over here, right?
Play e6 or something.
Well, e6, white will take on f7, and d6 or rook g1. It looks kind of strong. Here you have to neutralize the so-called Fischer bishop.
E5, isn't it?
What's that?
D5.
If d5, I think takes, followed by, well, rook g1 looks good. Bishop
yeah.
takes. I think simplest is probably bishop takes, e6, and now, well, rook g1 looks strong, aiming to come on g7, or also, well, queen e5 doesn't quite work.
He can go over with his own rook, g8.
Well, if rook g8.
Oh, but he can take the, white can take the pawn with check and lose the rook.
You have this f1. I still imagine white has something, but it's not clear. If d5, actually it might be rook g1 right away, just leaving the king on g8.
Yeah, black can't take the pawn.
Right. Yeah, I think this is not looking too
He
good.
can't move his king to defend it.
Yeah, white's going to take on f7 and play queen here.
I think that's the move.
Okay.
That's fast.
Yeah, so black has to act faster. Any other ideas?
C4.
Yeah, let's see.
Yeah. Chess logic at its finest, right? Yeah, neutralize this bishop at all costs, right? Black has no time for anything else.
Interpose a piece.
Yep. Turns out it's actually just fine for white. So for example, takes. Now, taking on c4, black will just play rook takes, and it's basically even position despite the scary looking position of the king. Now, if white tries to keep the bishop, then black can force matter by white either loses the bishop or takes the rook. And it turns out black is okay here. So, but you know, you can't blame Fischer too much. He kind of suffered from confirmation bias quite a bit. He won so many games because he also had great practical strength. He was very competitive, and he would just keep putting pressure on his opponents. And with every move you have to solve problems, you eventually get tired of it. And Fischer was very good at this. So that was kind of a problem for him in his analyses of games. But anyway, unfortunately, Larsen did not see this. Well, the problem now is that the problem now is that you can't play bishop takes d4 because we have this tempo taking on f7 with check. And if you try a move like rook c4 here, then white takes, and the black king is more open this time. Rook g1, queen h6. Black's a little bit slower this time, so it doesn't quite equalize. And black's game goes downhill very quickly. This is pretty much lights out from here. When your bishop is a pawn and white still has an attack going, it's just not good. And then Larsen just resigned here. Yeah, if you play like bishop e7, you have queen h6 check, right? Yeah, it's pretty nasty. You know, king g7, you have rook g1. This is just not fun, right? So yeah, this game was very interesting from how he crushed Larsen, but for me it's most interesting how this one game kind of put an entire opening out of fashion, and all because of his comments, basically. You know, if he was a little bit more objective, I think the dragon would have continued on, but yeah, the rest is history. Yeah. Any other questions about this game?
How many X-games did he put?
Well, who, Fischer? Well, rook takes h5 was definitely exclam worthy on move 22. You know, other than that, the position was basically equal. So, I mean, that was a strong move, but it was not necessarily winning.
That's why he didn't let him mate it.
Larsen? No, he did not. He did not play it out to checkmate. Yeah.
I don't know of any other games that Fischer played where he's played the mate.
Yeah, you may be right. Yeah, most.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Didn't want to give him the satisfaction, I guess. Right? All right, back to you, Lucas.
All right. Yeah, and just building off of what Warren was saying, Fischer, you know, I think it may come clear when I talk about the fact that that Fischer Fischer would play out endgames that were dead drawn and then beat his opponent. But he talked about the fact that his goal in playing was to crush his opponent's ego. And people reported a psychological pressure when they played Fischer, that he was just intense and put a lot of pressure on his opponents. Number one, because he was a strong player and because he would never give up, and he was very loath to accept draws. He'd deny draws and keep playing, and that kind of disconcerted his opponents. But also because he usually almost always had a big time advantage. He would create problems for his opponents, A, and B, his knowledge of the opening theory was extremely strong because he was constantly reading chess periodicals, particularly even Russian. He'd teach himself enough Russian so that he could follow along with those chess periodicals. And so he was always on kind of the cusp of chess theory, and because of that he played the openings really quickly. And then C, he played so much blitz that he could evaluate a position and make a move very quickly with uncanny accuracy. And so his opponents pretty much always had less time on the clock as Fischer, and that created challenges for them. Interesting thing about Fischer, he played so much blitz. People often remarked about how effortless he would actually physically move a piece. They would say that in blitz he would almost like throw it to the square and it would just land perfectly in the center. One person said, I can't remember who it was some GM said it's like he tosses pieces up in the air and they land on the perfect square for the piece. So that kind of play style would disconcert his opponents. Now, I'm going to kind of gloss over, in the interest of time, Fischer's play in the early to mid 60s. I talked a little bit about his accusations of a collusion among the Russian GMs at the 62 candidates tournament, and those theories are pretty much founded in fact. There's been some analysis done showing that the GMs were colluding, and in fact Spassky and Korchnoi talk about the fact that they got directives from the Central Committee saying draw against each other and then give everything you got against Fischer. So Fischer was worn down by playing all those long, drawn-out slugfests, while the Russian GMs would often just go in and do 18-move gentlemen's draws against each other, and and that was 15 minutes, and then they go lounge at the pool area or something. They'd save their strength for Fischer, and Fischer's opinion really turned against the Russians at this time. It's not surprising, and he made it his goal to unseat them. You should also know that Fischer, as part of his solitude, he listened to the radio a lot while he was studying chess, and in fact he became somewhat religious during this time. Now, his mom was Jewish, his father was Jewish, whether it was Nemenyi or Hans-Gerhard Fischer, both were Jewish, but there's no evidence that Fischer was religious. It's unclear whether he was circumcised, it's unclear whether he had a bar mitzvah or not. It's clear that he was not taken to church, and he spent a lot of his time, particularly on Sundays, looking for answers. He has no real mother figure, no real father figure, so he's listening to religious broadcasts and just flipping through the dial as he talks about, and he stumbled upon a broadcast by, like Pat Robertson he listened to quite a bit, and he stumbled across Armstrong. Now, Herbert Armstrong was the leader of a church, denomination of Christianity called the Worldwide Church of God, founded his own church, and it was, some have accused it of being a sect because of various aspects of it, and Fischer became very involved in the church in the mid-60s, and this would shape his life for many, many years to come. And I wanted to, instead of talking about his chess career, which is well documented, I want to talk a little bit about the influence of this religion on Fischer's career trajectory. First of all, the church imposed a Saturday Sabbath, which was not a surprise to Fischer. The Jews observe a Sabbath as well, and that meant no chess or anything else on Saturdays. Saturdays were reserved for prayer. So if Fischer ever wanted to participate in a tournament, the tournament directors would have to accommodate that request. Now, sometimes that was accommodated without problem. Sometimes that was accommodated, but they would count the Saturdays as Fischer's rest days. Every GM gets a certain amount of rest days in the tournament, and that would be Fischer's rest day. And he actually abandoned a tournament in the late 60s because of that, because he had fewer rest days, because he didn't count that Saturday as a rest day. It would also affect his psyche. The Worldwide Church of God was a very judgmental church. They believed that the second coming of Christ was due any day now, along with the apocalypse dictated by the book of Revelation, and that only the members of the Worldwide Church of God would be safe from that Armageddon. And they believed that every other denomination of Christianity and every other religion were in fact agents of Satan. And this was indoctrinated into church teaching, and it made the members very, as you might imagine, judgmental of any other faith and any other religion and anybody who was non-religious. And so Fischer became judgmental like this. The church had a practice called disfellowshipping. If you did anything contrary to the teachings of the church, you were disfellowshipped and kicked out. One of the members that was kicked out was Herbert Armstrong's own son, Garner Ted, because Garner Ted had relationships with women outside of marriage, which was not permitted under church teaching, and his father kicked him out of the church. And Fischer was this way with his acquaintances. If you did anything to slight Fischer, you were out. And we heard about this with Botvinnik, actually. Botvinnik would keep a list in his desk. If you remember, he had this little book, and if someone called him and said something unseemly to him over the phone, he would just hang up, mark their name in a little book, or before he'd hang up, he'd say, I won't talk to you again for 2 years. And he would note down in his book, so-and-so, 2 years. And he would not speak to that person again for 2 years. With Fischer, it was indefinite. If you were out, you were out. So if you did anything to slight him, he took an almost religious... He dismissed you with almost religious fervor, and I think that traces back to the church. It also explains why Fischer was so judgmental of people of other faiths, particularly the Jews, later in life. And finally, it explains what happened to Fischer's wealth. He donated, the church advised tithing, not just 10% just to the church, 10% for like special projects, another 10% for like these annual excursions, trips, retreats. And because of that, they had a nice corporate headquarters in Pasadena, California. But a lot of Fischer's money went straight to the church, and being a affluent, powerful member of the church gave you certain privileges. One was Fischer got to work out privately with the personal trainer of the church, and he did a lot of weightlifting and a lot of boxing. And Fischer says that the teachings of the church had a great positive impact on his chess career. Now, I'm not qualified to assess whether that was accurate or not. I kind of think it was the opposite, that he spent so much time focusing on religion and focusing on the teachings of the church and applying the teachings of the church to his everyday life, that it may have detracted from his ability to play organized matches, but it is what it is. Fischer made quite a bit of money from his tournament participation, gave quite a bit of it to the church. He was able to fly on their private jet, and he was able to attend special ceremonies at their corporate headquarters, or their corporate headquarters. That's bias. Their church headquarters, and he got to work one-on-one with the church's personal trainer, who taught Bobby how to box. And Bobby's actually a big fan of boxing. He didn't participate in matches himself, but he was inspired by, of all people, Muhammad Ali. And if Muhammad Ali could get $5 million for 60 minutes of work, then Fischer thought that he, as the best chess player in the world, should get, he, for a couple of weeks worth of work, he should at least get a pretty good income. And it's not that Fischer was greedy. In fact, Arnold Denker talks about the fact that Fischer was careless with his money. He would, maybe it was in his clothes, maybe it was on his nightstand, maybe he put some under the bed, maybe he had some as bookmarks. He didn't really, he wasn't close-fisted about it, but But Fischer thought that the amount that you pay for something is a direct reflection of the esteem you hold it in. And if the World Championship and if chess was the pinnacle of the sport, then he thought that it should command the same sort of respect and prize purse as a boxing championship. Anyway, just a window into his mindset. So in 1969, Fischer's not really played any tournament chess, but we're coming upon the candidate cycle leading to the World Championship. You may recall that Fischer did not participate in the U.S. Open after 1967, and the U.S. Championship was the way the U.S. seeded players into the interzonal. Now, because Fischer didn't participate, he didn't qualify for the interzonal, and so he wasn't actually supposed to compete, but Palbenko, Fischer's friend, said, who finished fourth, I believe, so he had the last spot. He said, well, I think Fischer should participate. I'd like to give him my spot. Well, the U.S. Chess Federation decided to ask Bill Lombardi, who finished fifth, another Fischer friend, would you like to take Benko's spot? And he said, well, I would, but I think Fischer deserves it. And the USCF went on and on through the 6th through 10th finishers and asked them all if they wanted Benko's spot, and they all deferred to Fischer. So Fischer's participation in the candidates tournament and his eventual winning of the World Championship happened with an extraordinary circumstance, and this is one of a string of extraordinary circumstances which is going to arrive. The next was he played in the interzonal, and he dominated. He finished 18.5 out of 23. He won first place by like 2.5 points. He crushed the competition. And this is after he hasn't played hardly any tournament chess in about a year and a half. Now, after he participated in the interzonal, he started playing in match play. He played in the USSR versus the world. He played on second board. He actually deferred to Bent Larsen, and this was very surprising because Fischer did not like conceding first board to anybody, least of all Sami Reshevsky, and they really had a rivalry because the USCF kind of preferred Sami Reshevsky over Fischer, and Fischer despised him for it. But anyway, he ceded first board to Larsen, thank you, for the USSR versus the world. And on the second board, Fischer scored 3 out of 4 against Petrosian. Actually, the rest of the world lost that match, 20.5 to 19.5. It was really close. But Fischer was the top scorer for the rest of the world. And after that tournament, there was a lightning chess, a blitz tournament organized, and the Soviets thought they were going to knock Fischer down a peg because they had Tal and Petrosian, who were in Korchnoi, the strongest blitz players in the world, they thought. And Fischer won that 19.5 out of 22. It was a double round robin, and the only person who scored a win on him was Korchnoi, and Fischer won their other match. So Korchnoi was the only one who had an even record. He 2-0'd Tal, he 2-0'd Petrosian, he drew a couple people here and there, but he really crushed the competition. This sent a strong message. He then won a lightning event at the Manhattan Chess Club. I think this time it was like 19.5 out of 20, one draw, and this was a strong field. Dinker talks about how incredible this result was. Fischer was on a whole nother level here, and the Western press knew it. The Russians weren't so sure. In fact, Botvinnik predicted that in the match play that Taimanov was going to win. Taimanov got crushed 6-0. After that, they said, well, Botvinnik said, and I don't know the exact quote, but he said, okay, what Fischer did was impressive, but if he thinks that he's going to do the same thing against Larsen, he's got another thing coming. Fischer won against Larsen 6-0. And then Botvinnik said, well, there are certain miracles that occur in chess, but I predict that Petrosian is going to beat Fischer. And at first, their match looked pretty close. Fischer won the first match, and that had been his 20th win in a row. He was on an absolute tear. Petrosian won the second match, so they knew he was at least going to make a match out of it, and then there were 3 draws. And then Fischer beat Petrosian 4 straight games, which had never been done to Petrosian and never would be done again. A couple interesting things about this. When he beat Taimanov, Taimanov was so disgraced that he told Fischer after the match, "At least I still have my music." Because Taimanov was a concert pianist. And that was wise, that was prescient, because Taimanov was basically kicked off the Soviet team. There was a 2-year ban on his participation in any tournament, nationally or internationally. And this was kind of a punishment for shamefully representing the USSR. And it wasn't lessened at all by the fact that Fischer did it against Larsen also. Now, in 1972, this is when we're getting the lead up to the match. There's a lot of media attention. Life magazine has a profile of Fischer. The media is talking about him incessantly, and for good reason. Fischer, after the candidates match, his FIDE rating is 2785. Now you may think, well, Caruana and Carlsen, you know, and a couple of other people, Aronian, they have higher ratings than that. I don't see what's so spectacular. Remember that FIDE ratings at the time were much lower then than they are now. The next highest rated player in the world was 2665. That's 120 points lower than Fischer, and that was Boris Spassky. Imagine being over 100 points higher than the second highest rated player in the world. This is a condition that may have occurred when Kasparov was so dominant over Karpov. I'm not entirely sure.
Nope.
No?
No, Karpov was always on his heels.
Okay. But I remember for a while Kasparov was the only one over 2,800, and Karpov was the only one over 2,700, but I guess the gap wasn't that big. So it's never happened since then, and Fischer was the favorite. Of course, the Soviets didn't necessarily think that, and for good reason perhaps. Fischer had never beaten Spassky. He had lost 3 games and had like 5 draws. It's kind of like, I kind of think of it like Caruana against Nakamura. Before this year, Caruana had never beaten Nakamura. Maybe now but it's definitely not like Nakamura versus Carlsen, who's Nakamura's never won. But Fischer had been challenged by Spassky, and also you have to understand the Soviets threw all their resources at defeating Fischer. They had built a dossier under Botvinnik's direction, which was everything they knew about Fischer and his play style, and they had trained with Spassky. Geller was there, and Geller was Spassky's second. He had a winning record against Fischer. They invested everything they had into beating him. Fischer, for his part, didn't work with anybody. He didn't have a dossier. He just did his own thing. Now, the match of the century, if you will, it's been dubbed that, it almost never happened. I told you about Fischer's unlikely participation in the candidates. You should also know that Fischer almost didn't travel to Iceland. It took a lot of intervention. For one, it took James Slater, who was a millionaire from England, to put up some extra money to double the prize purse. The prize purse went from $125,000 to $250,000, and this is unheard of in chess. In fact, a prize purse didn't exceed this until I think the late 80s. So this was a huge prize purse that Fischer couldn't really ignore, although Fischer certainly would have liked for it to have been even higher, for one. For two, it took the intervention of Bill Lombardi and Miguel Quinteros, who was a GM from Argentina. It took the two of them to convince Fischer to go. Fischer still wasn't going to go. When they finally went, it took the two of them to keep him there. And when he was there, Fischer, even though he won the first match against he lost the first match against Spassky, he wasn't even going to play. He didn't even show up for the second match. And there's Spassky sitting there waiting with Lothar Stein, a GM from Germany, who was also the chief arbiter. Fischer didn't even show up for the second match, and this is after he's complained about the board and the chairs and the lighting and then this and the cameras and this, that, and the other. Fischer doesn't even show up. He forfeits game 2. And they think that Fischer's not going to show up for the third match, and they're just going to FIDE's going to have to just award the title by default to Spassky. But what Fischer does is he asks Spassky, if they could play in a different room because the lights and the television cameras and the spectators and this and that and the other. And Spassky actually agrees. Spassky's quite the gentleman. And there's a quote from Korchnoi where he says something like, gentlemen may do well with the ladies, but they don't win at chess. Spassky was a gentleman. They agreed to play in another room that had been used for table tennis, apparently. No spectators or anything in Game 3. And from then on out, they moved back to the main room, but Bobby's in the match. Now, with some changes, first of all, they were very crazy about enforcing the noise rule. Fischer get upset if somebody was unwrapping candy, and the chief arbiter had to constantly, hold the crowd to silence. They removed all of the television cameras, and the Icelandic Chess Federation wasn't happy about this because they had counted on television revenue to offset the cost of sponsoring the match. The TV producer who had bought the rights to broadcast it was not happy about it either. And he actually sued Fischer and the Icelandic Chess Federation later on. And instead, what happened was journalists were doing telegraphs to live update, and the television, and there was television broadcast in the United States, which was basically using demo boards to communicate what's happening in the match. And this was broadcast on live television in the United States. It got quite a lot of attention. And if you're curious about this, the best book written on it, I think, is the New York Times report on the match of the century. And when you read it, I couldn't help but sympathize with Boris Spassky. Fischer was tough to deal with, his conditions. One thing you might have heard of is he requested sole use of the pool at certain times. Everybody else had to be out of the pool. And he had a security guard to ensure that nobody disturbed him. So there he is swimming in the pool all by himself. He actually did, this isn't widely known, but he got a visit from his mom. She's wearing a blonde wig there as a disguise so the journalists wouldn't find it. But she came and visited him. She was living in England at the time, and she flew over and stayed with him for a night in his suite. And there he is meeting with her and smiling for the camera and going over the game, I think, from that day. But you have a couple of quotes there from people who knew Fischer and GMs, obviously, about Fischer's attitude, because while Spassky has his team, and every time he goes back to his room, he's got this team of people around him. He's got like a psychologist, and he's got a minder from the KGB, and he's got some chess grandmasters, helping him analyze positions. Fischer's got himself. He had Lombardi there, and he had Quinteros there, but he didn't ask him for advice. He didn't go over games with him, or he would maybe to humor him, but he did it all by himself. Anyway, so Fischer won, as has been documented, and this was important for a couple of reasons. First, it was part of the cultural Cold War. It had been widely believed by Soviet GMs that their success showed that Soviet success showed the superiority of the communist form of government. And Fischer's win was a shock to that, obviously, first. And some people have said that Fischer's win over Spassky was the most important event of the Cultural Cold War between the Apollo moon landing and the Miracle on Ice in 1980, the Olympics, where the U.S. beat the USSR's hockey team. That Fischer's win was the most important event in between those two very well-known events. And when he came home, he was an instant celebrity. Here he is with Bob Hope and Dinah Shore. He appeared on the television programs, a lot of photo ops, a lot of endorsement deals. He turned down every single one of them. He was offered millions of dollars in endorsements, and he turned them all down. People were begging for him to support certain products. And they're trying to make it so easy for him, where all he had to do was like a 5-second blurb that appeared on TV, turn him down. And this is another misconception about Fischer. People think that he was money grubbing. Not necessarily. If he was, he would have accepted all that money in a heartbeat. He was perhaps principled. He thought that chess should be elevated to a higher level, and he thought that people should pay more money for chess world championships. It wasn't necessarily about the money that he wanted to get. It was about the money that he thought he and chess were worth. slightly different take on it. All right, so before we get into Bobby's wilderness years, as they've been dubbed, when he drops off the map entirely, let's look at game number 3 for tonight, Fischer versus Taimanov from their match. Obviously, spoiler alert, we know who won. And Taimanov had high hopes for this match. It's funny, he likened Fischer to a computer, and now we liken Carlsen to a computer, and Carlsen has said that he's inspired by Fischer. But they had a similar style. They didn't have a lot of inaccuracies in their game, and so. But Taimanov thought that his creativity would avail him well in his match against Fischer, and we know that that was not the case. But let's see exactly how that worked. So I'll turn that over to Warren.
Thanks. By the way, mentioning the World Championship match, he really kind of changed chess forever. Before that World Championship match, they were usually just played for peanuts, basically. Typically you might get like 5,000 rubles or something like that, which is, I don't know what the conversion rate was at the time, but it was not near 250,000 US dollars. Okay.
Do you think that like the sponsorship would have helped further, like, because he wanted the prize purse to be in the match, but like, and I know a lot of sports and like a lot of things, the sponsorship is kind of what elevates that. I don't know, but I guess that wasn't what he was interested
That's a
in.
good point. Absolutely, he could have made the game.
Yeah.
Oh, that would have been huge.
Greater than
sponsor. Yeah.
Well,
Absolutely could have.
In '75, the bids for hosting the match against Karpov, the highest bid was the Philippines. They offered $5 million.
Wow.
Yeah, so it went from $250,000 in '72 to $5 million in '75, and as we'll find out, Fischer still didn't take it.
Yep. Anyway, from that match, Spassky got 70 plus K, and I mean that was part of the agreement, right? Even the loser of the match would still get some money, and in Soviet Union at that time, that was an incredible sum of money, and Botvinnik actually kind of ridiculed Spassky for even having the money, basically. Spassky indulged himself and actually purchased his own Volvo, and this was kind of an unheard of luxury in the Soviet Union to own a car, much less a Volvo, right? An exotic import, right? So, and he was actually not looked upon favorably by people such as Botvinnik, right? Who thought he was kind of violating the principles, right? That he was living above what the average person was supposed to be. So, just an interesting point. But I mean, I think it was for the better. I mean, after that, even though some of the later World Championship matches may not have approached immediately the numbers he got, from then on, I mean, nowadays it's on the order of over $1 million. So he had a huge impact. If not for Fischer, I'm not sure what would have happened. Another important note is that Fischer was really the first professional chess player, I would say. Before Fischer, people had other occupations. Botvinnik and Max Oive.
Botvinnik was an electrical engineer, PhD electrical engineer.
Yeah.
Tall was a teacher. Yeah.
Everyone else had something else they did during the day, but Fischer, he did chess. And it really showed in his games, and we'll see in this game with Mark Taimanov, it's remarkable. His knowledge was just amazing. So anyway, let's get to this. By the way, this was the second game in his match with Taimanov. Now this was in the 1971 candidates, so you probably know who won this game since we talked about how he was shamed, but nonetheless, let's see what happened. So, of course, it's only just that he plays the Taimanov Sicilian. This was not a surprise for Fischer, but he nonetheless knew this variation very well. Now, Kasparov later on in his career was to take on Karpov in this variation. Now, an interesting note is that c4 is what Karpov chose instead of Fischer's bishop f4. And it's kind of a more positional line, although black has kind of an interesting speculative pawn sacrifice, but we won't go into that. I'm only noting that Fischer prefers bishop f4, which is more active and more double-edged. And this kind of game he preferred. He wanted to have some kind of initiative. So
Come back for the Karpov lecture in 2 months.
Yeah, exactly. Which that game is going to be in there if we go into that. But anyway, so he prefers this more double-edged game. And yes, knight f6 is good. Now, the theory of this variation was not really so well developed at the time. Now, he played queen a5. Now, in the spirit of the Chelyabinsk variation, a6 would have been a stronger move. Okay. Now, the idea is that it looks counterintuitive in a way because you're forcing white to go back and head for this d5 square, but you really need to kick this knight off of attacking that c7 square. Ends up being a pain for black later in this game, as you'll see. So, but this was kind of still its infancy, so at the time this was cutting edge, or whatever you want to call it. So white plays this interesting pawn sacrifice that I'm not sure Taimanov was expecting. So instead of queen d2, white can play bishop d2, and white can keep himself from losing his pawn. But Fischer had studied this. There had been some games before then, so Fischer knew what he was doing. Now here, black has a problem with his knight on the edge of the board, and the fact that c7 is difficult to guard. So king d7 is almost forced, but black is doing okay. Now here is where Taimanov was kind of surprised, and where Fischer had actually found his following move in a Russian article by Nikitin, yeah, Kasparov's later trainer, actually. Now, he had written an opening article about this, and this was, he wrote it in 1969, 2 years before this game took place.
Yeah, but Taimanov didn't know about it.
Yeah, not even Taimanov, who can actually read Russian natively, right, didn't know about it, but Fischer, who could read it, did.
And a specialist in the Sicilian, Taimanov is one of the world's foremost authorities on it.
Oh, yeah.
He didn't know about it.
So, I mean, the fact that Fischer knew about this is just remarkable. I mean, no doubt he basically blitzed out every move here. This was just knowledge for him. You know, even though it was 2-year-old knowledge, it was still knowledge. You know, his mind was like big database, you could say. So knight c3 is the key move here. Now, what Taimanov had failed to appreciate was that apparently he had briefly considered this move, but thought that a6 was okay for black, thinking that white was forced to play knight takes e4 when black is fine after, say, check and king c7. Black's okay here. But what he didn't realize is that white has the crushing knight e5. And this b6 fork is going to be decisive. Moves like rook b8 don't help because the rook is stuck, right? So this is what Taimanov failed to appreciate. And this causes black problems because white really dominates these central squares here. Here it's king d8's okay. It's kind of hard to offer a better suggestion. It looks awkward, but the idea is that you need to give room for your bishop to get out. Okay. So the knight just goes right back to b5, right? This a7 point is kind of weak. a6 is a bad idea because of bishop d6. So it's kind of awkward for black. Now, here black really needed to play actively and play his trumps. d5 was definitely called for here. Okay. Now, even though you might lose a7, say bishop takes a7, this is acceptable for black. You know, he can play knight c6, and he's going to be okay. The loss of this a pawn is not a tragedy. Of course, if you think about chess principles, it makes sense, right? It's not a central pawn, doesn't control too much of importance. Okay. It's worth it to get a strong center and release this bishop. Okay. But Taimanov was a little bit greedy and tried to hold on to his material. Now again, if white takes on a7, say knight takes a7, and black's doing fine with a move like, say, knight c6. Okay. So instead, Fischer just castles, keeping the pressure. Now b6 just defends a7. Again, that was kind of a passive move. d5 would have been better. Black really needs to allow himself room to develop his pieces. Now, black was not worried about knight takes because black can exchange, and now he consolidates, gets his pieces in the game. So Fischer did not just give black this option. Plays f4, just increasing the pressure. Immediately he's threatening to take on e5, and if black takes on f4, white just gets another attacker on this weakness. So black's really being reduced to passivity here. He's actually doing okay, but it's a difficult position to handle, and this is the kind of situation where Fischer really thrives, just where you have a nice advantage where you can keep giving your opponent problems. Now the idea of bishop e2 is to bring it here, attack that knight. Here he's just preparing double rooks on the d file. Yeah, it's already a difficult situation. Now bishop takes b5 was a mistake actually. He could have played a6. Now this may look scary because white has these rooks bearing down on the d file. But knight takes d6 is actually not quite so simple, because if white takes on d6 like this, then black can actually surprise white here.
Bishop g5?
Bishop g5. So matters aren't so simple. Although this is still correct for white, he has to play king b1. But even so, black consolidates here. And black is equal. So this was probably the last simple chance Taimanov had to really simplify the game. Because after this, after he gave white the two bishops, it's really not easy to defend this situation. Fischer really demonstrates the power of this here. I mean, if I was playing Fischer, I would not have given up my last squared bishop, because I never want to leave the Fischer bishop unopposed. Okay? I'm not sure why Taimanov didn't think this way.
You wouldn't give up a bishop, period, though.
Well, yeah, that's my personality, I guess. Yeah. To me, that's one of the 7 deadly chess sins, but that's neither here nor there. So I think it's actually quite pretty the way Fischer arranges these rooks. First doubles them on the d file, and then 2 moves later, they appear doubled on the e file. It's kind of pretty, right? Now, one of his ideas is to possibly invade with a rook e7 check, right? At least this is one possible idea. Now, with rook c8, he was getting the rook out while he could, because, for example, if he chose to play, I don't know, let's say some innocuous move like h6, then Fischer would have played rook e7. And this is so difficult for black because his rook is hemmed in, and it's difficult for him to save these pieces. For example, king c8, we have bishop a6, and there's just pins everywhere, right? And if we play, instead of king c8, we play king b8, and we have moves like bishop c6, right? And now black has more troubles, right? Can't move the knight, threatening b7. So this is what Fischer was planning, invasion on e7. So this just makes you understand why Taimanov played rook c8. Okay. So now, attacks weakness on f7. Black has to passively defend. Now b4. Now this may seem kind of surprising, but the idea of the move is actually kind of simple. Yeah, just keeping the knight fianchettoed on b7, right? Now, if it was a bishop, it would be a good thing, but fianchettoed knights are typically not a good idea.
There's nothing to threaten the pawn b4 either.
Well, black can play bishop c3, but here it's not such a good idea. White can just offer the trade, right? So black tries to get rid of this pawn, which is guarding c5, but now bishop d5. Again, Fischer plays very concretely. What's white's threat here? Black cannot just take the pawn.
You can go rook e7 check.
Right, rook e7. And black loses his knight.
For a rook plus,
plus an attack, so it's pretty vicious. So black has no choice but to guard against that threat. And white's really starting to build nice pressure. This crossfire of the bishops, right? He just defends the pawn. Black's trying to defend all of his weak points. Kind of hard to suggest anything else. Fischer again plays concretely, just takes pawn. Right? It may look kind of unnerving to leave white's king, which looks open like this, but white's actually doing okay. Black doesn't have any firepower over there to punish that. Now, by the way, I should mention the idea of bishop c3 is to get rid of white's 2 bishops, basically. Okay, it's much easier to defend an endgame when your opponent doesn't have the 2 bishops. It's usually half pawn advantage, right? Because of the kind of crossfire they can create. So black's at least trying to exchange 1 pair. So when you're trying to defend an endgame, his idea with d3 here is just trying to exchange pawns. The fewer pawns on the board, the fewer weaknesses you have, the easier it is to defend. So that's why he's trying to exchange here. Now, although black's position is difficult, it is actually savable. despite the fact that it looks like black is going to be down a pawn. Now here is probably the last chance where he misses save. Yeah, so knight b5 was a mistake actually. So what he should have done was gone for g6. Now the point of this move is not obvious, but the idea is after, say, bishop g4, now he can play knight b5. And if white were to play king b2, then black can take, followed up by rook d4, forking the bishop and pawn. Right? Now if white instead goes to b3, then black gets the knight to d4 at tempo, and he guards his pawn. Okay. Now if white instead goes to f3, then black plays knight b5. And the idea is that, again, this knight comes to d4, and the e2 pawn is not so easy to get rid of. Because now if he takes it, he runs into this nasty pin. So this was black's really last chance to save the position. Of course, that's a really, really subtle tactical point. I definitely don't blame him for missing this. I mean, it's pretty hard to see that you need to lure the bishop to a square that can either be taken by the knight on d4 or attacked by rook on d4. So that's really hard to see. So we don't blame him for playing knight b5 right away. But unfortunately, he's going to be condemned to defending an endgame down a pawn. And the way Fischer fights and just keeps playing and playing, you can imagine the wear it must have had on Taimanov. So this was actually a blunder for white. So this is where he loses his pawn. He should have played rook a6 instead. Okay, and now after, say, king c7, now he can finally play c5. Okay, the point is here he's able to keep this pawn, but in the game he loses it. This knight threat coming there was pretty strong, and now unfortunately it's hard for white to guard this. Okay. Now if he plays rook b6, black just goes back, and it's kind of unclear how white's going to make any progress here. Remember that g2 pawn is kind of weak, so he has to go back. So here, people were pretty surprised that Fischer was still playing. I mean, this is an endgame that most grandmasters would agree John without a heartbeat, right? But Fischer didn't care. He just wanted to win. Okay, he was very competitive, especially when you have a winning position. Like, it was more winning before. Fischer didn't really play so accurately, right? You kind of feel justified in playing on because you should win the game, right? According to the just theory, right? So he just kept playing and playing, and Taimanov eventually just lost the thread. So white just keeps attacking these weak points, right? Making it hard for black to move his pieces. He does succeed in winning this pawn, but the endgame is drawn. But unfortunately, Taimanov misses a number of draws here. Okay. Now, for one, he could have taken this bishop on g4 immediately, and this is a drawn rook endgame. Okay. But he decided, I'll just keep the knight. Okay. Unnecessary. Again, taking on g4 results in a drawn endgame. And here is the critical moment. So after 81 moves, even though Fischer has been pressuring the entire game, Taimanov still has a draw. But he only has one king move that gives him a draw.
Oh, yeah.
One is a mistake, which he plays, but the other one draws. So what do you think is the king move that draws?
He has to head toward the promotion square, right?
You'd like to.
No.
King e4, I think.
Right.
King e4 is what he played.
Oh.
How could he get
But this
back
is the
to
losing move. Yeah, it's the most intuitive move, but... Well, what do you guys think you know what the problem with going to e4 might be?
You go bishop
So if we think about it, what we have to do is block the pawn with a knight somehow. And the only way the black knight can block the H pawn is at f3. The problem with going to e4 is that the white bishop can give a check on that long diagonal. So what happened was bishop c8.
And that's like the only
the killer move.
Yeah.
It's the only move that wins, but it wins.
Yeah.
The problem is that knight f3 blocking the H pawn, white takes the knight. There's a tragedy, right? But of course, if the king were on d4, bishop c no longer works. Knight f3. Now, white can drive the knight away, or at least try to. It looks good, right? But the black king gets to the corner. White has the wrong colored bishop. So black just leaves the knight there and heads for the corner. Yeah. So this was the only way to draw. Yep, not necessarily obvious, but pretty tragic. See, unfortunately, he missed it, and then Fischer, of course, is able to convert this. Now the H pawn is too far gone. And then here, at this point, he resigned. Yep, there's no way black can cover the queening square.
Why did he move his knight back? Like, he was just wasting moves. Like, just to spite him? Like,
oh, you mean after?
Resign anyways. Either play it out.
You mean at this point?
Yeah, when he did it like 3 times. Or not, not many times did.
Oh. I mean, it's hard to explain why someone would keep playing when they're losing, right?
You have to come to terms with the law.
Yeah, it had to have been disheartening, yeah.
Maybe I get a stalemate.
Always the chance that the other guy can move up.
Maybe Fischer will touch a piece by accident or something like that, you know? Who knows? Yeah, you know, what's really interesting about this game is just how Fischer kept playing on even in an objectively drawn position, but he still had better chances. You know, he was justified in playing, but you know, it wasn't really common for players at that time to play out endgames like that. It was almost considered like respectful to just agree drawn in kind of position. Fischer was just relentlessly competitive. He just wanted to win. He didn't even care if he needed to or not. He could be 3 points ahead of the field. He still wanted to win. He couldn't care less if the drawing would still give him the money. He wanted the status, the dominance. That was what he cared about.
There's a game in the Chess Olympiad actually where Fischer just needed a draw in the last round to take first place in the Olympiad, and his opponent, I think his Medinus or something, offered him a draw. Fischer turned it down. He ended up losing the match and finishing second in the Olympiad. And he didn't care. He's going to turn down a draw offer. He wants to win.
Yeah. Yeah, this game also illustrates how well he plays with that Fischer bishop. It's I think magical what he does with light square bishops. You know, if you ever want to see someone handle bishops, then he's the guy to look at. Much like Carlsen is today with handling rooks. You know, Fischer was just amazing with this light square bishop in particular. He won a number of really nice endgames with just bishop against knight and pawns on the board. He was really good at handling these kind of positions. Anybody have any questions about this game? I feel exhausted. I feel for Taimanov kind of losing this game. You know, kind of played pretty diligently, but just couldn't withstand the pressure. And even though he had the draw on the end game, he just was too tired to see it. All right, thank you, Lucas.
So, Fischer didn't play any chess, any tournament chess after the World Championship until 1992, actually, which we'll get to. He had a lot of offers, and there were a lot of tournament organizers who wanted him to play, but he just, he didn't. He was still active in the chess community. He'd talk to people, he'd analyze games, that sort of thing, but he didn't want to compete. And this isn't all that surprising, given in 67, 68, he kind of stopped playing then, too. He was supposed to defend his title against Karpov, but even before Karpov was his scheduled opponent, Fischer wanted to change the World Championship structure. Now, recall that Fischer's accusation of collusion among the Soviets in '62 led to the end of round-robin candidates tournaments and the beginning of knockout matches. And so Fischer thought that the World Championship could be improved as well. For example, he wanted 10 wins, no unlimited number of games, and if they were tied 9-9, then split the prize purse and the champion remains the champion. Well, FIDE adopted the 10-game thing, They adopted the idea that if it were 9-9, it'd be drawn, so the challenger would have to win 10-8. But they rejected the unlimited number of games. They were really worried that it could stretch on 50, 60 games. Now, Fischer wanted an unlimited version of games for a couple of reasons. First, he didn't know his competitor as well as his competitor would know him. He had never played Karpov. First. Second, Fischer had not played very much and he was rusty. And he knew that a longer match would favor him because he could get back into the swing of things, figure out his opponent, and then go on to win. Second. Third, he knew that Karpov had a propensity to draw. And, of course, Spassky did as well. But if you look at, like, Korchnoi and Karpov, they had a ton of draws. And if you look at Karpov and Kasparov, they had a ton of draws as well. You may remember that World Championship match series went on a crazy number of games, and then FIDE just called it. We'll get to that when we talk about Karpov. But Fischer wanted to be an unlimited amount of time. FIDE balked at that idea, and they tried to hold special congresses to see if they could come to some sort of agreement. Fischer wasn't having any of it, and he resigned. Now, I want to point out, he says, FIDE has decided against my participation. Fischer had a bit of a persecutory complex. He thought people were out to get him, and this is a pretty clear example of that. Now, after this, Fischer goes into this wilderness years, which is what journalists have termed it, because he just drops off the grid. Doesn't do media interviews, doesn't do anything, and what he does is he moves to Pasadena, California, where the church, Worldwide Church of God, is headquartered, and in that time he starts reading. Now, he reads a lot of stuff that form his thinking and give him a target for the conspirators, and he settles on the Jews. Now, he settles on the Jews for a couple of reasons. First, the U.S. Chess Federation was heavily represented by Jews, Samuel Reshevsky, for example. Second, most of the Russian players were Jews, Botvinnik, for example, and so they were part of the establishment. And third, he read some literature, including these two works, that heavily influenced his thinking. Now, I want to take a moment to deviate a little bit about the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's termed different things because that book was actually a literary forgery. It was actually written by Russian secret police in 1903, and it was based on a couple different works, and there's a whole history to it. But a lot of people accepted it as fact of a Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. One of the early proponents of the authenticity of the document was Henry Ford. When you bought a Model T car, you've got a copy of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion with it. The Dearborn Independent, which was his newspaper, often went on anti-Semitic rants. And so it was very well established as a document which anti-Semites used to justify their positions. And it happened to be a document that inspired Hitler, and Mein Kampf references it. It inspired Fischer. Fischer read it, and actually the last letter Jack Collins ever got was a letter from Fischer with a copy of that book saying, I found this interesting. And of course, Collins is a Jew. And it was, or taste, and it was, and this book is also still sold to this day. You might find it at the airport in Jakarta, Indonesia being a very Muslim country. It's still used as a justification to be an anti-Semite and an anti-Zionist, be against the Israeli state. It's referenced by Hamas in Palestine, for example. So this forgery has gotten some traction, and it still exists today, and it was heavily influenced to Fischer, and it made him, along with other things, a pretty rampant anti-Semite. So he lived in Pasadena, California. He stayed sometimes in LA on Skid Row. He didn't have much money. In fact, he said he left the Worldwide Church of God in 1977 after a series of sex scandals. It came out that Herbert Armstrong, the founder of the church, had molested his daughter for a number of years, and they had also predicted the end of the world a couple of times, and that hadn't come to pass. And so Fischer left the church, and he called them agents of Satan. Shouldn't be surprising that he'd say that. But he said, The Worldwide Church of God cleaned my pockets out, frankly. I have some money left, but not that much. I've got some assets. It's amazing they didn't get everything. Now my only income is a few royalty checks from my books. And he talks a little bit more about that, but actually Fischer didn't have any income except for a couple of royalty checks from time to time. And on Regina's instruction, Joan Fischer forwarded Regina's Social Security check to Bobby as well, and that's what he lived off of. He lived in a 35 square foot room that was a bed, a bunch of bookshelves full of chess books, and a bunch of cassettes containing his rants about all sorts of things. He was also bitter about the U.S. government. I should mention very briefly that Kissinger had called Fischer and encouraged him to participate in the World Championship and said, we look forward to your participation, and win or lose, we'll invite you to the White House, blah, blah, blah. Nixon never invited Fischer to the White House, maybe because he was busy with, Watergate. But but Fischer was very bitter about not getting that invitation. He felt slighted by the U.S. government, and so his paranoia was extended to Jews and to the American government and to FIDE, and you can imagine that that contributed to his non-participation in chess. Now, Dr. Ponterato, in the psychobiography of Bobby Fischer, does a really interesting thing. He looks at the family history of mental illness for Bobby Fischer, and he finds some interesting things. First, his mother was Regina Winder, that's her maiden name, and Regina's mom, Natalie, so Regina Winder thought that her mom died in the Spanish flu of 1918, or 1918, when the outbreak came through and ravaged, a lot of different places, and a significant number of people died from the Spanish flu in 1918. However, she did not. She actually, Regina's father committed her mother to a mental asylum, a state mental hospital in New Jersey, and said she died of the flu. Well, she actually died in the mental hospital 3 years later, but it's obvious that Regina's mother had a mental illness. Paul Nemenyi, his probable biological father, well, he was considered unstable. That when he was accepted in the United States as an immigrant because he was a brilliant scientist, the Emergency Committee and Aid of Displaced Foreign Scholars did a report on him saying that he was a, quote, unstable and undesirable person. His colleagues referred to him as a misfit, say he didn't get along with people, and that he was kind of weird, that he carried soap around in his pockets because he was constantly afraid of germs, and he wouldn't touch door handles. Okay, so the father, probable biological father, had a problem. Well, what about Peter? Remember the half-brother who sent a letter to the psychiatrist, a pretty caring letter? Well, Peter went on to earn his PhD in mathematics from Princeton, wrote a couple textbooks on statistics. They're still used today. But at the end of his life, in the 50s, Peter suffered a mental breakdown. He had prostate cancer. He was living in North Carolina. In an apartment crammed with statistics papers, sounds a lot like Fischer, and his friends would spot him pushing a shopping cart down the street wearing oven mitts as gloves, until he finally committed suicide in 2002. Okay, so we have probable mental illness there as well. What about his mother? Well, Regina Fischer had been investigated by the FBI ever since she put Joan up for adoption, Joan up, and remember the family reported her for potential communist ties? Well, the FBI, in their anti-communist hysteria, investigated her and started basically a 20-year investigation. The full document's available from the FBI. It's like 994 pages long. They spent tens of thousands of dollars. They had agents follow her. They had agents interview all of her contacts, because they ruled that they had her evaluated by a psychiatrist actually in the 40s, and the psychiatrist says she had a stilted personality, stilted meaning paranoid, querulent meaning combative, but not psychotic. So Dr. Ponterato said that if she were diagnosed today, she may be diagnosed with a paranoid personality disorder. Here you see her protesting in Vietnam. She was arrested many, many times for civil disobedience. She went on to become a physician, by the way. She got a PhD in hematology, very highly educated, and she devoted her life basically to humanitarian causes. But his mother may have had a history of mental illness also. So where does that leave Fischer? Well, Dr. Ponerato places a lot of caveats and says, well, it's hard to diagnose someone when they're not alive and I can't interview them. But based on my interviews with Bobby's brother-in-law, Joan's husband, Joan had passed away by this point, and based on his conversations with Bobby's acquaintances like Bill Lombardi and Frank Brady, the author of this book, or the author of Endgame, sorry, and based on Bobby's expressions, like his interviews that he'd given like on radio, Philippine radio, he said that, Fischer probably had a paranoid personality disorder and a delusional disorder, where a persecutory type, where he thought people were out to get him. In fact, Fischer, after his win over Spassky, was extremely afraid the KGB was going to assassinate him. Now, that may not be far-fetched. I don't know. The KGB files, if they exist, haven't been made available. But they certainly suppressed dissidents in Russia, and they certainly did everything they could to try to assure that Russian players would triumph over Fischer. In fact, Petrosian was a KGB agent. Karpov was a KGB agent. Again, come back in 2 months. But the point is that Fischer may have been well-founded in his belief that the KGB was out to get him, and that may explain part of why he disappeared off the grid. But the point is that he was very troubled, and Dr. Ponerato ascribes this to 3 factors. Family history, number 1, not surprising. A troubled childhood, number 2. Financial hardships, lack of a father. He was temperamentally difficult. And number 3, media pressure. Fischer was not very well equipped to deal with the media pressure. Okay, so Fischer disappears off the grid. Nobody's really seen or heard from him until 1992, when a young Hungarian chess prodigy sends him a letter and says, I admire you, and I'd like to, talk to you about chess. And Bobby calls her, like 2 a.m. Hungarian time or whatever, and they start a phone conversation, and Zita actually flies to Los Angeles to meet Fischer, and they discuss chess, and they play some chess. And this is strange because Fischer is pretty misogynistic when it comes to women playing chess. But I think he was pretty desperate for companionship and acceptance. And so they initiated, I don't know the extent of their relationship. She stayed a couple of weeks, then flew back to Hungary. But Fischer agreed to let her try to organize a return match against Spassky. And she was the one who got the financial backing for the return match. So the revenge match of the 20th century it was in 1992. It was hosted in Yugoslavia. Now, Yugoslavia is where Fischer played the Portoroz Invitational, back when he was 15 years old, and it's not surprising that he'd be drawn to a bid from Yugoslavia. It was also fairly close to Hungary, where Zita was from. But Yugoslavia at the time was under the control of Slobodan Milosevic, and the person who was putting up the money for the tournament, which was $5 million, was actually an arms dealer. And kind of a mafia type. And so the State Department sent Fischer a letter, which he's holding in his press report, that says, if you compete, you'll be in violation of U.S. sanctions against Yugoslavia, and you could face a fine and or a 10-year prison sentence. And Fischer famously spit on this letter at a press conference and went ahead with the match anyway. And while he was and now this match was interesting for a number of reasons. First, Fischer gave a lot of press conferences. It was really the first time he'd been seen at all. There hardly, I don't know that there are any pictures of Fischer between like 1976 and like 2002. There were some television, or 1992, sorry. There were some television organizations that like tried to stalk him and get video footage, and it was just extremely difficult to do, and he never agreed to interviews or anything like that. So this was the first time the world had really seen him in 20 years, or seen his chess in 20 years. So we know that Fischer won the match, and we also know that that it was fairly convincing, 10-5 after 30 matches, and that's the rules they're playing to. First person to 10 wins, draws don't count. And Kasparov said, it was pretty sloppy. And if you were to ask Kasparov in 1992, he would have been really critical of it. I think he said something like, yeah, he played okay, but if we were to play, it wouldn't even be close. Now, part of this was trash talking and psychological warfare, because there was rumors after Fischer handled Spassky that they should arrange a Fischer-Kasparov match, and this seemed like a possibility. And Kasparov was probably getting his ducks in a row and starting the trash talking early. Now, Yasser Seirawan, who is at the St. Louis Chess Club, was there and spent quite a bit of time with Fischer and said he's the most misunderstood person in the world. He'd found him, congenial and well-spoken and this, that, and the other. And we saw a picture in the last Spassky presentation of him flipping off the audience. He still had his thing about spectators and candy wrappers, but Fischer played pretty well, and there was a lot of hope. But Fischer knew that he couldn't return to the United States after this, because if he did, he'd face arrest. So instead, he took his winnings, which was about $3 million. He stuck it in a Swiss bank, and he set up in Budapest, in Hungary. Now. There's a couple of reasons he may have chosen Budapest. One, Budapest is a pretty neat city if you've never been. It's nice. Second, Budapest is in Hungary, and Zita is from Hungary, and Fischer still had hopes of marrying her. In fact, he proposed and she said no. Yeah, ouch. Wow. And so Fischer may have stayed in Hungary to try to continue that relationship with Zita, but it was also, and I haven't seen this mentioned, and I don't really know if this is plausible, but you may remember Paul Nemenyi was from Hungary. Maybe Fischer is trying to reconnect with his father's roots. It's speculation, and there's no corroboration of that, but he also at this time met the Polgar family, lived there for a while. Susan, Judith, and the third sister's name? Sophia, yeah, Polgar. And actually, he kind of had a thing for Susan that the father didn't like at all. So the father kind of said, "You're not really welcome here much longer, Bobby, because keep your hands off my daughter," sort of thing. Bobby had a thing for younger women. Anyway, so also while he was in Budapest, he met he met Andor Lilienthal, and you may know that name as someone who played in the 20s, 30s, and 40s in Europe and in the USSR. And he struck up a friendship with Lilienthal and was often over at his house, and Lilienthal would regale him of tales of, the good old days of chess and Capablanca and Alekhine and this, that, and the other. And Fischer was always appreciative of that. But then Lilienthal gave an interview with the media and took Bobby's picture without Bobby knowing. And then Bobby, never saw him ever again. He cut off all contact, as Bobby was wont to do. After living in Budapest for about 10 years, Bobby renewed his passport in Switzerland, and then he moved to the Philippines. He split his time between Philippines and Japan. Now, the reason he did that is because he didn't have a visa to stay in any of the countries longer than 90 days. So what he did is he'd spend 88, 89 days in the Philippines, then 88, 89 days in Japan. And during this time, he lived a double life. In the Philippines, he had a relationship with Marilyn Young, who is quite young, and then a daughter was born named Jinky. Now, Marilyn claimed that Jinky was Bobby's child, and Bobby acted like Jinky was his child, but it later turns out that Jinky was not his child. And he also struck up a relationship in Japan with Miyoko Watai, who was part of the Japanese Chess Federation, and they lived basically as husband and wife. And in fact, they married in 2004, September 6th, actually. So Fischer was a fugitive, and he had said some things that annoyed the authorities. There he is looking like, disheveled, in denim, which he was quite fond of, even though, gone are the suits and the svelte figure. This is Bobby with a paunch and a homeless look about him. And Bobby said some things that really annoyed the authorities. He talked about, the United States. And this was on September 11, 2001, right after the bombings. You can imagine that didn't go over very well. He would talk a lot every time he was on the radio in the Philippines. He'd talk about, the Jews and their conspiracy and how he had to raise attention about it. And there's a lot of more explicit stuff that he said that I won't put on there. There may be children watching online later. But the point is, he made the government go from just ignoring him to actually doing something about it. So they canceled his passport. He was arrested in Japan when he tried to fly back to the Philippines. You probably know the story. He was in jail for 8 months while a solution was sought to keep him from being extradited to the United States and facing charges. What happened was a team of people intervened on his behalf and got him citizenship, full citizenship in Iceland, which took an act of Congress, literally. But they gave him Icelandic citizenship, which gave Japan somewhere to extradite him to that was not the United States. So Fischer moved to Iceland, and he lived there from 2004 until his death in 2008. It was kind of an imposed exile. He was stuck there, couldn't really travel. This was very hard for Fischer, both when he lived the double life between Japan and the Philippines and in Iceland, because his mother passed away, his sister passed away, his niece Elizabeth passed away at a young age of cancer, and he wasn't able to go to any of the funerals because he would have been arrested on sight, and that really was, I guess, the final straw between him and the United States, and that he never got invited to the White House. So Fischer spent his days eating in restaurants because he never cooked. And he would, by the way, he'd take like his juicer with him so that he could have fresh squeezed orange juice with his meal. He ate mostly vegetarian food. He would spend his afternoons and evenings in bookstores, and then later when the media found out about the bookstore, he went to the library, and the librarians were completely silent about him being there, and the media never found out, so that became his refuge, and he read. And this is something that Fischer did from the 70s on. Remember, as Warren said, he was a professional chess player, and the Soviets actually criticized this. They called him uncultured, and this was a criticism he took to heart. And for the last 30 years of his life, he was a prolific reader, all the time reading anything, philosophy, history, geopolitical stuff, literature, and he can converse on almost any of the subject. He also could converse fluently in German, in Russian, in Spanish, in English. So he filled those gaps, and he learned languages. He had taught himself a little Russian. His mom had helped him with it when he was studying Russian chess magazines, but he became completely fluent when he lived in Budapest, actually, and that stuck with him. Now, Fischer is very stubborn. He had a great distrust of medicine. He believed that everything could be cured with vitamins and juice. Sounds like Steve Jobs. And he was diagnosed. Finally, his friends convinced him to go see a doctor because he was in such pain, and he was diagnosed with kidney failure. And the doctors told him he needed dialysis. That was not happening. Fischer refused. And so his health declined fairly rapidly. He was cared for by a friend's wife who was a nurse. They lived in the same building. And so between his friends and that wife, they kept pretty much a constant vigil on him. He was finally admitted to a hospital when it appeared that the end was near, and he died in January of 2008. Per his wishes, he was buried in a rural cemetery in Selfoss, Selfloss, Selfoss, Iceland, in a Catholic ceremony in a little cemetery, and it's become a tourist attraction. I'm sure he would hate that idea. And there was a little battle. He had not written a will, so there was a battle over his estate, which was valued around $2 million. The claimants were his nephews by his sister, two brothers who live in California. One's a lawyer, one's a doctor. So they were one party. That was Alexander and Nicholas Targ. The other party was Marilyn Young, his girlfriend from the Philippines, and the daughter Jinky Young. And then the other party was Miyoko Watai, his wife from Japan. Well, the Icelandic courts considered all those claims. They actually exhumed Fischer to do a DNA test for paternity, found that Jinky Young was not related to Bobby Fischer, so that claim was thrown out. They verified Miyoko's marriage to Bobby, and then threw out the claim of the nephews, and Miyoko was awarded sole possession of his estate. And I told you last time Spassky visited his grave and looked at and said, it looks like the spot next to him is open. So who knows? Spassky is getting up there in age. We'll see. But I have a feeling Spassky will be buried in Moscow because he's a national hero there. Anyway, I used a couple different sources for this, and there's one actually I didn't list. And that's my 60 memorable games that Warren said he used. So I didn't add that, and I will before I distribute this. And then at the very end, I have a bunch of images. I put all the references for my images and some quotes that I didn't end up integrating. If you're interested, I can email you the PowerPoint. And even though it's late, if you have questions, by all means, we can try to answer them.
Did his wife know about the Filipino girlfriend?
Yeah, and she was fine with it. It's interesting. Their relationship was somewhat strange because the friends said that they lived as husband and wife, but when Fischer was in Iceland, Miyoko Watai did not move there to join him. She stayed in Japan where she had a career as a pharmaceutical rep. So Bobby was really sexually repressed when he was young. I think he in fact, he lost his virginity during a chess tournament in Argentina, and it was a woman that I think Pal Benko had set him up with. And Fischer did terribly in that tournament. And he said, "I'm never going to mix women in chess again." And by all indications, he didn't. I'm sure he stayed celibate because it was a major part of church teachings until '77, and after that, he didn't have money or any relationships. I don't know about his extensive relationship with Zita, but toward the end of his life, he seemed to have got over his shyness and his awkwardness around women. But even then, when they were together, they looked like a married couple, but they spent 9/10 of their time apart. It's an interesting relationship, and I don't know that Miyoko Watai has ever really talked about that in depth. But yeah. Any other questions? Okay, well, the goal is to put this up on YouTube tomorrow. Next month, we're going to be looking at Korchnoi, who, even though he's not a world champion, has been considered by many to be the strongest chess player in history to not become world champion. So we'll do, again, biography and analysis of his games, and then we'll go to Karpov and then Kasparov. And there's so much about Kasparov, that'll be a two-part thing. So that's kind of the plan for the next couple months.